Hey my friend, if this is your first time here, this is Sleepy Old World, and what we do is simple. We go back in time, together, slowly, and we look at the parts of history that never make it into the documentaries. Before we get into tonight's story, I want to say one small thing. If this has become part of how you fall asleep, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps this little channel keep going. It costs you nothing, and it means everything. And I would love to know, honestly, where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you are in a quiet flat in Toronto. Maybe you are lying in the dark somewhere in Ohio. Maybe you're on a night shift break in Sydney with your phone propped against a teacup. Wherever you are, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, even the ones that just say a place name and nothing else. I love this community. All right, let your shoulders drop. Good. Let's go. Picture a hallway mirror. Small, spotted at the corners where the silvering has worn thin, hung at exactly the height a woman needs to check that her collar sits straight before she opens a front door. That mirror is where tonight's story actually starts. Not in a ballroom, not in a countess's dressing room with its own lady's maid and its own fire kept burning through the night. A hallway mirror in a narrow house checked quickly, out of habit, dozens of times a day. She might be the one glancing into it. Maybe she's just come up from the kitchen with flour still on her wrist and does not have time to notice. Maybe she's standing there on purpose, turning her chin slightly, deciding whether the dress will do for a caller who has not even arrived yet. Maybe, and this is the version that keeps pulling me back, she checked that mirror 4 times today already, and it is not yet noon, and nobody in her house has ever once commented on how well kept she always seems to look, because to them it simply is how she looks. The way weather simply is the weather. Here is the strange part, the part that took me a long time to actually sit with. This woman is, by any reasonable measure, working harder with her own 2 hands than her mother ever did. And she is doing it inside a world that insists loudly and constantly that a respectable woman of her station does not work at all. Not with her hands, not really. That fiction has to be maintained every single day. And maintaining a fiction, it turns out, is its own kind of the labour, quieter than scrubbing a floor but no less exhausting by the end of a long week. It is 1876, a Tuesday, late in October, and somewhere on a street of newly built brick terraces, the kind still faintly smelling of wet mortar in the wrong weather, a house is just beginning to wake up around her. Call her Beatrice. It is as good a name as any. And by the end of tonight it will feel like the only one that fits. The house is cold. That is the first thing you would notice if you were standing in it right now, in the dark, in your night clothes. Not dramatically cold, not the kind of cold that makes your breath visible, but that particular damp chill of a house with no fire lit yet. Brick and plaster holding the night's temperature the way a stone holds cold water. Beatrice is awake. She has been awake for a few minutes already, lying still under the blankets, listening. There is a particular sound a house makes right before anyone else in it is up, a kind of held breath, and she knows it well. Somewhere below her, in the basement kitchen, her one servant, a girl named Alice, is supposed to already be lighting the range. Beatrice is listening for the sound of the poker against the grate, and she does not hear it yet, and this small absence of sound is already, at 5:50 in the morning, the first small anxiety of her day. Here is the thing that surprises people most when they actually learn about this life, rather than absorbing the postcard version of it. The middle-class Victorian woman is often working harder, in raw physical terms, hours on her feet, tasks completed with her own 2 hands than many working-class women, because the working-class woman who goes out to work in a mill or a laundry at least has defined hours, and comes home to a household where nobody expects appearances to be maintained. Beatrice has no defined hours. Her work day does not clock in and clock out, and she has an entire performance layered on top of the labour. A performance that requires her, whatever she has actually been doing with her hands and her back since before dawn, to appear in the late morning parlour looking as though she's done nothing more strenuous than arrange flowers. She swings her legs out from under the blankets and her feet find the cold floor. And there is a moment, brief but real, where she simply sits there on the edge of the bed in the dark, gathering herself. Her husband, whose name we can call Edmund, is still asleep beside her, breathing slow and even, and she will let him sleep another 20 minutes before she wakes him, because his day, though it will feel long to him, a train into the city, 10 hours at a desk copying figures into ledgers, a train home, is in a certain sense simpler than hers. His day has a shape that other people set for him. Hers does not. Hers is a shape she has to build fresh every single morning, out of whatever the day happens to bring, out of whatever Alice has or has not managed to do, out of whatever the butcher's boy forgot to deliver, out of whatever small crisis presents itself before breakfast is even on the table. A candle from the box of matches on the nightstand gives her just enough small orange light to find her dressing gown and pulls it around her shoulders. Here is a detail that I find genuinely striking every time I sit with it. Beatrice dresses herself, fully, every hook, every button, every lace. There is no Ellis, no lady's maid standing behind her doing up a row of 30 small buttons down the back of a bodice, which is in fact one of the real, practical reasons why middle-class fashion, when you actually study it, tends towards slightly simpler fastenings than the fashion plates worn by the wealthy. A woman with only herself, or occasionally a hurried maid with 4 other tasks waiting, to dress her, cannot wear a garment that takes 40 minutes and 4 hands to get into. So her corset laces at the front sometimes, or she has learned a particular trick of half lacing it loosely from the front, and only tightening the back by reaching around herself. An odd little contortion that any woman who's ever tried to zip up her own dress in a hurry would recognise instantly, separated from her by only about 150 years. Downstairs she goes, still in her dressing gown, candle in hand, because 6 in the morning is early enough that the household has not yet organised itself into its daytime version, the version with the parlour door closed and the front hall swept and everyone in their proper place performing their proper role. This is the house's private hour, the one nobody outside the family ever sees, and it looks nothing like the house they see. Alice is there already, thank goodness, on her knees in front of the kitchen range with a scraper, clearing yesterday's ash into a pan before she lays the new fire. Alice is 19. She came to this household 2 years ago from a village outside the city, sent by her mother because there were 6 children at home, and 1 fewer mouth to feed was 1 fewer mouth to feed. She is what the household guides of the era call, with a kind of brisk, unsentimental honesty, a maid of all work, and the phrase is exactly, precisely accurate. She does all of it. Cooking, cleaning, laundry assistance, fires, fetching, carrying, answering the door, and she does it for wages that, if we are honest about the numbers, come to something in the neighbourhood of £12 to £18 a year, plus her keep, which means a small attic room and her meals eaten standing in the kitchen, or perched on a stool, and 1 afternoon off most weeks if the household is a reasonably kind one. I want to sit with that figure for a second, because I think it is easy to hear a number like £12 a year and let it slide past without really feeling it. £12 a year is roughly what Edmund, the bank clerk, might spend on a single good winter coat and a decent pair of boots. It is less than 1/10 of his salary, and Alice's labour, in a household like this one, is the entire hinge on which the family's respectability turns, because a family that can afford even 1 servant has crossed a line, a real and socially loud line, between the working class and the middle class. It does not matter that Beatrice herself will spend the next 3 hours doing physical work nearly identical to what Alice is doing. The presence of Alice in the house, the simple fact of her existing and being paid wages, is the thing that announces to the street outside, to the other wives at church, to the tradesmen who deliver to the door, that this is a respectable household and not merely a striving one. Beatrice ties on an apron over her dressing gown, an apron that never appears in any portrait, in any calling card scene, in any of the fiction of the period that concerns itself with women like her, and she begins on the breakfast. This is not a servant's task this morning, not entirely, because Alice is still occupied with the range and then must move to laying the dining room fire, and then to fetching the milk from the doorstep and the bread from where it was left, and there simply are not enough hands in this house for one girl to do everything before 7:30. So Beatrice cuts bread. She fries what needs frying. She warms the teapot. Her own mother, a generation earlier, in a household with slightly more money and 2 servants instead of 1, never touched a frying pan in her life. And Beatrice knows this, and there is a complicated feeling buried in that knowledge that she does not examine too closely most mornings because there is no time to examine it. Some mornings, though, some mornings it surfaces. Here is a fact worth pausing on, because I think it reframes the whole picture. Historians who have gone through household account books and servant registries from this period, and there are quite a few such books that survive, estimate that by the 1870s something like 1 household in 3 among the lower middle classes in England employed exactly 1 servant, no more, and a great many households that considered themselves solidly middle class, in every other respect employed none at all for stretches of time, between girls, as the phrase went, when one had left for a better position, or for marriage, and the next had not yet been found. The gap between the 1-servant household and the 2 or 3 servant household was not a small gap in daily experience. It was the difference between a wife who worked physically every single day and a wife who could, at least sometimes, sit down. Edmund comes down at 7:15, dressed, his collar starched and his boots polished, both of which, incidentally, Beatrice or Alice did the night before, because starched collars need to dry overnight after being stiffened with a mixture of starch and water that Beatrice mixes herself in a small basin kept for the purpose. He eats his breakfast. He reads yesterday's newspaper, folded from last night, because a fresh one will not be available at this address until later in the morning, delivered by a boy on a bicycle who has 40 other houses on his route. Edmund does not ask Beatrice how she slept, not out of unkindness, but out of a kind of unthinking structural blindness that is honestly one of the more heartbreaking small details of this entire arrangement. He assumes, without any active thought at all, that she slept and rose and will simply produce breakfast, and produce a functioning household, and produce 2 clean children ready for the day, the way the sun produces morning. It is not cruelty. It is closer to something like weather, an absence of noticing so total it does not even register as an absence. At 7:20 he puts on his coat, kisses Beatrice on the cheek, and walks the 11 minutes to the railway station where he will take a 2nd-class ticket, because 1st class is for the men above him, and 3rd class, packed and rough, is for the men below him, and everything in Edmund's life, including this daily choice of railway carriage, is a small act of location, a way of telling the world and himself exactly where he stands. The house exhales slightly once he's gone, not because anyone dislikes him, simply because a certain tension, the tension of being watched, of the household needing to look complete and correct for the man who represents it to the outside world, eases a little when he is not physically present in it. The railway itself is worth a small pause here, because it changed something about time that people living through the change barely noticed happening. Before the railways spread the way they had by the 1870s, a town kept its own local time, set by the sun, a few minutes different from the town 20 miles away, and nobody much minded because nobody much needed to compare the two. Trains could not tolerate that kind of looseness, and so railway time, standardized, uniform, the same minute in every station clock across the whole network, gradually became the time, the one everyone's pocket watch was set against, whether they ever boarded a train or not. Edmund checks his own watch against the station clock every single morning, an unconscious little ritual, and Beatrice's day, though she has never once set foot on a train this month, runs according to that same standardized hour, because the whole rhythm of calling times and dinner times and church times has quietly reorganized itself, over the preceding decades, around a kind of time that did not used to exist at all. Now the children need attention, and this is where we should talk about something people often get wrong, which is the assumption that a middle-class Victorian mother had very little to do with her own children because there was a nanny or a nursery maid handling all of it. That is the wealthy version again, creeping back in. In a household like Beatrice's, there is no nanny. There is Alice, who has the whole rest of the house to manage, and there is Beatrice, and the children, a boy named Frederick, who is 8, and a girl named Louisa, who is 5, are substantially her direct responsibility from the moment they wake until the moment they sleep. She washes Louisa's face and plats her hair, a task that takes real patience because Louisa's hair is fine and tangles overnight into something that requires slow, careful work with a comb, section by section, while Louisa fidgets and asks questions that do not always have easy answers, the way 5-year-olds do. Why is the sky that colour today and not another colour? Why does Papa go away every day and come back only when it is nearly dark? Beatrice answers what she can and deflects what she cannot, and braids the hair and moves on to the next thing, because there is always a next thing. Frederick at 8 is old enough to dress mostly himself, though his collar needs adjusting and his boots need lacing properly, the double knot that will not come undone by 10 in the morning the way his own attempts always seem to. He will walk to a small day school a few streets over, run by a clergyman's widow who takes perhaps 15 boys of good family for a modest fee, teaching them Latin declensions and arithmetic and a great deal of scripture, preparing the ones whose fathers can afford it for a proper grammar school in a few years' time. This is itself a fact worth sitting with. Frederick's education, however basic at this stage, is aimed forward, toward a profession, toward continuing and perhaps improving on his father's position in the world. Louisa's education, when it begins in earnest in a year or two, will look completely different, will aim at an entirely different destination, and we will come back to that difference later tonight because it says something quite important about what this whole society believed a woman was actually for. Before any of that, though, before school, before the account book, before any of the day's business properly starts, there is the street, and I want to spend a moment there because a Victorian street had a soundscape all its own, one that no recording ever quite captured, one that has essentially vanished from the world entirely. The milk cart comes first, usually iron wheels on cobbles, a particular grinding rattle that every child on the street learns to recognize before they learn much else, followed by the milkman's call, not shouted exactly, more chanted, the same rising and falling notes repeated door to door. Somewhere behind that, fainter, the coalman, his cart heavier, slower, the horse's hooves landing with more weight, and behind him the muffin man on certain afternoons, a bell rather than a voice, a small brass sound that Louisa has learnt to listen for the way a modern child listens for an ice cream van. The smell changes through the morning too. Coal smoke first, thick and a little acrid, rising from 100 chimneys at once as every household in the street lights its range within the same narrow half hour. Then bread, if the wind sits right, from a bakery 2 streets over. Then faintly hoarse, always hoarse, a smell so constant in a 19th century city that people of this era mostly stopped noticing it at all, the way we no longer notice the hum of our own refrigerators. Beatrice notices none of this consciously most mornings. It is simply the texture of being alive in 1876, present and unremarkable, the way the sound of traffic is present and unremarkable to you right now, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight. For now, though, it is 8:15 in the morning, and Beatrice has gotten 2 children fed, dressed, and out the door, has fed and seen off her husband, has assisted with breakfast preparation, and has not yet, in any way that the outside world would recognize, begun her day, because her day, the visible day, the day that will be discussed at church on Sunday and referenced in calling card conversations next week, does not start until she appears, composed, in a clean morning dress, in her own front parlor, ready to receive whatever the day brings in the way of visitors, tradesmen, or obligations. Everything before that moment is invisible. It happened for 2.5 hours, involving real physical labor and real emotional management and real problem solving. And by the social logic of 1876, none of it counts as anything at all. There is no bathroom attached to this house in the way we would recognize one today. No tap running hot water at the turn of a handle. A proper bath, a full one, happens perhaps twice a week, usually evenings, when a tin hip bath is dragged in front of the kitchen or bedroom fire and filled, jug by heavy jug, with water heated on the range and carried up by Alice, one careful trip after another, until there is enough to actually sit in. On the other days, washing means a basin and a jug on the washstand, a flannel, cold water that Beatrice has long since stopped flinching at, a quick, thorough, efficient routine performed standing in a room that October has already made properly cold by this hour. Once Alice has cleared the breakfast things, and before we get to the account book, let me take you into the parlor itself for a moment, because I have mentioned this room several times tonight without actually describing what sits inside it, and I think the objects matter almost as much as the ritual. On the mantelpiece, a clock under a glass dome, its pendulum visible, ticking with a small brass voice that Beatrice has heard so many thousands of times she no longer hears it at all. Beside it, a pair of lustre vases, wedding gifts from an aunt on Edmund's side, never once used for actual flowers because real flowers might drop petals on the good tablecloth beneath them. On a small round table near the window, something called a whatnot, a tiered stand crowded with small treasures, a piece of coral brought back by a cousin who went to sea, a stereoscope with a box of photograph cards showing views of Switzerland that nobody in this household has ever visited or ever will, a dome of wax fruit so realistic that Louisa, at 3, once tried to eat a wax pear and had to be gently redirected. Every chair back wears a small square of white crochet work, an antimacassar, a word that sounds almost invented until you learn where it comes from. The men of this era used a hair oil called macassar oil, heavily scented, and it stained upholstery badly enough that a whole small industry of protective doilies grew up around the problem, each one made by hand, each one another few hours of a woman's needlework folded invisibly into the furniture itself. The carpet is patterned busily, deliberately so, because a patterned carpet hides wear and dust far longer than a plain one, a practical calculation disguised quite successfully as simple taste. Nothing in this room is accidental. Nothing in this room is only what it appears to be, and Beatrice dusts every single object in it, every single day, by her own hand or by Alice's, whether or not a single visitor ever walks through the door to see it done. She opens the household account book at the small writing desk in the corner of the dining room, not the parlor, the dining room, because the parlor is for show and the dining room is for the actual mechanics of running a household. This is a real object, and if you have ever seen one in a museum or in the digitized archives that some libraries have put online, you will notice how strikingly ordinary it looks. A plain ruled notebook, columns for expenditure, a running total kept in ink that sometimes blots where a pen has been pressed too hard by a tired hand. Beatrice keeps this book religiously every single day because the entire moral architecture of middle-class Victorian womanhood rests, more than people realize, on the ability to manage money without ever appearing to think about money. Edmund earns, let us say, £220 a year, which places the family solidly, comfortably in the lower reaches of the middle class, well above a skilled workman's wage but nowhere near the income of the professional classes above them, the doctors and barristers and prosperous merchants who might earn £800, £1,000, £1,500 a year and keep 3 or 4 servants and a carriage. Out of £220, Alice's wages and keep take perhaps £25. Rent on the house, a modest but respectable terrace, takes another 40. Coal, which in a cold climate and a house with several fireplaces to feed, is a genuinely significant expense, might run to £15 across a year. Food, clothing, the children's schooling, church subscriptions, the small unavoidable costs of maintaining the appearance of gentility, a decent hat, a good pair of gloves, a subscription to a circulating library because a household like this one is expected to read though not too adventurously. All of it has to come out of what remains. And here is the quiet, grinding truth of it. There is very little slack in a budget like this. A doctor's bill for a sick child, an unexpected repair to the roof, a run of bad weather that damages Edmund's good coat and requires a new one. Any of these can tip a careful year into a difficult one. Beatrice does not discuss money with Edmund every evening, because that would suggest she cannot manage, which would itself be a small social failure, a crack in the composed surface she is meant to maintain. Instead, she manages quietly, cutting where she can, substituting where she must, letting a dress go another season by adding new trim rather than buying new fabric, serving a cheaper cut of meat on Tuesdays and Wednesdays so that Sunday dinner, the dinner that might include a guest from church, can be more generous. This kind of quiet, continuous, invisible financial management is, I would argue, one of the primary occupations of a woman in Beatrice's position, and it is almost never acknowledged as work in any of the writing from the period, because work in the minds of the men writing about respectability and domestic virtue meant something you were paid for, something that happened outside the home. What Beatrice does inside the home, the endless calculation, the endless small sacrifice dressed up as taste or preference, simply does not register on the same scale. There is a phrase from the period that I keep coming back to from one of the household advice manuals so popular at the time, the kind of book every respectable young bride received as a wedding gift. And the phrase goes something like this, that a wife's economy should be so skillfully managed that her husband should never suspect there was any economy at all. Sit with that for a second. The goal is not simply to save money. The goal is to save money so completely invisibly that the man whose comfort depends on it never has to think about how it happened. That is not accounting. That is a kind of theatre performed daily for an audience of one who does not know he is watching a performance. By 9:30, the accounts closed for the morning. Beatrice puts on her outdoor clothes, a plain wool dress in a dark, practical colour, a bonnet, gloves, and goes out to do the marketing herself. This detail surprises people almost every time I mention it, because it runs so directly against the image of the Victorian lady floating through her day untouched by errands. A wealthy woman like the ones we have talked about in other episodes on this channel would never be seen carrying a basket down a public street. She would send a servant, or the tradesman would call at the house directly, presenting their best cuts and their freshest produce for her approval from the comfort of the morning room. Beatrice does not have that luxury. Alice has the house to manage. So Beatrice herself walks to the butcher, the greengrocer, sometimes the fishmonger if it is a Friday and the family observes that particular tradition, and she does this walking, this carrying, this haggling in a quiet, controlled, entirely respectable way over the price of a piece of mutton, in public where anyone might see her. The butcher's shop itself is worth stepping into for a moment. Sawdust scattered thick across the floor to soak up whatever the day's trade leaves behind. Hooks along the back wall hung with carcasses in various states of being broken down, the smell of blood and cold fat sharp enough that Beatrice has, over the years, learned to breathe through her mouth slightly without ever quite admitting to herself that this is what she is doing. The butcher himself, a broad, red-faced man named Hollis who has held this shop for longer than Beatrice has lived on this street, greets her by name, asks after the children, and shows her the cut she wants without being asked twice, because a good tradesman remembers exactly what a regular, respectable customer prefers and exactly how much conversation she wants alongside the transaction, which in Beatrice's case is a moderate amount, friendly but brief. And this is where the social tightrope gets genuinely narrow, because there is a real anxiety, one that shows up again and again in the letters and diaries and etiquette manuals of the period, about exactly how a respectable woman is supposed to shop without appearing to actually care about money in front of the shopkeeper. The performance requires her to negotiate gently over pennies while somehow radiating an air of complete unconcern, as though the penny in question means nothing to her at all, when in fact that exact penny might be the difference between a slightly better cut of meat on Sunday and a slightly worse one. Shopkeepers, for their part, understood this dance perfectly and played their role in it, extending credit to respectable households as a matter of course, keeping a running account settled quarterly rather than requiring cash on the spot, because cash on the spot, oddly enough, could look almost common, could suggest a household living too close to its means to be trusted with credit at all. Credit, extended and honoured, was itself a badge of respectability. It is a strange little inversion when you think about it that owing money in the right circumstances to the right people on the right terms was actually a mark of social standing rather than a mark of trouble. She returns a little before 11 with her basket, and now begins the part of the day that will actually put food in front of the family this evening. Because in a household with only one servant, the mistress of the house is very often, quite literally, in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled up. Alice can manage the plainer, everyday cooking, the porridge and the boiled vegetables and the simple stews that stretch a small piece of meat across a family of 4. But anything requiring particular skill, a proper sauce, a cake for a Sunday when guests are expected, the kind of dish that a cookbook like the enormously popular household management guides of the era would treat as a genuine test of a housewife's competence, that falls to Beatrice. She is, in the fullest sense of the word, a working cook in her own kitchen several days a week, measuring, tasting, correcting, standing over a hot range in a room that in October, with the fire going, becomes genuinely uncomfortably warm even as the rest of the house stays chilly. Her hands, if you looked closely, which nobody in her social circle ever would, because looking closely at a lady's hands would itself be a small breach of manners, show it. Slightly reddened knuckles, a small burn scar on the inside of her left wrist from a kettle handle that slipped 2 winters ago. These are not the hands of the portrait. These are the hands of the actual woman. Let us slow down here for a moment and talk about the parlor, because I think the parlor is the single most revealing object in this entire story, more revealing than any dress or any account book. Every middle-class Victorian household, no matter how modest, no matter how carefully every other penny was counted, maintained a front room, a parlor, kept for show. This room held the best furniture the family owned, often bought on credit and paid off slowly over years. It held ornaments that served no purpose except to signal taste and refinement, a clock under a glass dome perhaps, or a small collection of pressed flowers under glass, or a piano, which we will come back to. It was kept spotlessly clean, dusted daily, its fire laid and ready to light at a moment's notice, and it was used in many households only a handful of times a week for receiving callers, for Sunday afternoons, for the rare occasion when the vicar came to tea. Meanwhile, the family actually lived, ate, worked, argued, and existed in the back room, the dining room, or a small sitting room, a space that was warmer in every sense, more worn, more honest, more theirs. The parlour was not a room for living in. It was a room for being seen in, a stage set maintained at real cost in money and in labour, purely for the benefit of an audience that might, on any given day, never actually arrive. Think about that for a second. Beatrice dusts and polishes and arranges a room every single day on the chance that someone might call. Most days, nobody does. The performance happens anyway, because the possibility of an audience is enough to require the show to go on. There is something almost theatrical about the whole structure of middle-class respectability when you look at it this way, and I do not think that comparison is unfair or reductive. The house itself is divided quite literally into backstage and front of house, the way a theatre is divided into the parts the audience sees and the parts they never do. The kitchen, the scullery, the servants' attic room, these are backstage, unseen, unglamorous, where the actual mechanics of the production happen. The parlour is front of house, and everyone in the household, mistress and servant alike, understands perfectly which spaces belong to which category, understands that a caller must never, under any circumstances, glimpse backstage, must never see Beatrice with flour on her hands, or Alice carrying a coal scuttle through a room a visitor might enter. This is, I think, one of the genuinely strange and slightly sad features of this whole world, that an entire class of women organized their days, their houses, and to some degree their identities around the management of what other people were and were not permitted to see. And it worked both ways. Beatrice, when she goes calling herself, which she does most afternoons that she is not receiving callers of her own, walks into other women's parlours and sees only their front of house too, their good china, their well-swept hearths, their composed hostesses, and has no way of knowing, standing there in her good afternoon dress making polite conversation about the weather and the health of mutual acquaintances, whether the woman across from her spent her own morning with her hands in a mixing bowl, or her own account book balanced by candlelight the night before, with real anxiety behind the careful figures. Every woman in this world is performing for every other woman, and every woman in this world almost certainly knows, somewhere underneath the performance, that the woman across from her is probably doing the exact same thing, and yet nobody says so. Nobody ever says so. That particular silence, I think, is one of the loneliest details in this whole history. By noon, Beatrice has changed out of her cooking apron and into a clean afternoon dress, because the afternoon belongs to calling, and calling in this world operates according to rules so precise and so widely understood that an entire genre of etiquette literature existed purely to explain them to anyone unsure. Each household kept what was called an at-home day, a specific afternoon of the week, on which the mistress of the house would be available to receive visitors, and every other respectable woman in the neighbourhood knew, or could easily find out, which day belonged to which household. Beatrice's at-home day is a Thursday. On Thursdays from about 2 until 5, she sits in the parlour, that carefully maintained stage set, in her good dress, prepared to receive whoever might come. Calling cards themselves deserve a moment, because they were a small technology of social negotiation that most people today have never encountered and would find, I think, quietly fascinating. A card, simply printed with a name, sometimes an address in the corner, was left at a household as a way of registering that a visit had occurred or was being offered. If you called and the lady of the house was not receiving, or if she was out, or if she simply did not wish to see you that day, a servant would take your card at the door and you would leave, and the exchange of that small piece of cardstock was itself a complete social transaction, understood by everyone involved without a single word needing to be exchanged about what it actually meant. A card with a corner turned down signalled one thing. A card left in person rather than sent by a servant signalled another, a slightly higher degree of respect or intimacy. Whole relationships, whole social hierarchies were maintained and adjusted through this quiet traffic of small printed rectangles, and Beatrice, like every woman of her class, understood the code fluently, the way you or I understand which emoji means genuine warmth and which one is faintly sarcastic. The conversation on a Thursday afternoon, when someone does call, tends to circle around a fairly narrow set of acceptable topics. The health of mutual acquaintances, the weather, discussed with more genuine interest and more actual variation of opinion than you might expect, because weather affected everything: coal consumption, the state of the roads, whether the children could be sent out to play, news from the newspaper, filtered carefully, because political opinions, strongly stated, were not considered entirely proper for a lady to voice, though plenty of women had them anyway, and found ways to imply them without stating them outright, a skill that I suspect required more verbal dexterity than simply saying what you thought. And needlework, almost always needlework, because a caller and a hostess would frequently sit together with their sewing in their laps, hands occupied, the actual conversation running alongside the stitching rather than instead of it. This detail matters more than it might seem to at first. A woman's hands in this world were almost never simply idle. Even in the most social, most leisured-seeming moment of the week, the hands kept working, hemming a handkerchief, working a piece of embroidery, mending a small tear, while the mouth carried on a completely separate conversation about Mrs. Pemberton's health or the vicar's sermon last Sunday. Mrs. Pemberton, actually, since I have mentioned her twice now, lives 4 doors down, and she and Beatrice have known each other for 6 years, since the Pembertons moved onto the street. I want to tell you about her for a moment, because a story like this one is never really about a single woman. It is about a whole street of women running nearly identical lives at slightly different volumes. Mrs. Pemberton's husband is in trade, a respectable draper with his own shop, rather than a clerk drawing a salary, which places her family in a slightly different, slightly more precarious position than Beatrice's, because trade, however prosperous, always carried a faint social shadow that a profession like the law or banking did not. Mrs. Pemberton compensates for this, if that is the right word, by being, if anything, more scrupulous about her calling days, her morning etiquette, her children's manners than anyone else on the street. She is, in her own way, working even harder than Beatrice at the same invisible performance, because she has more ground to make up and less margin for a single visible mistake. The two of them host dinner, in turn, perhaps 4 times a year each, and I think the anxiety of hosting deserves its own honest telling, because it rarely appears in any tidy way in the etiquette manuals themselves, which describe the correct number of courses and the correct seating order, with total confidence and no acknowledgement at all of what actually goes on in the kitchen beforehand. A dinner party on Beatrice's budget means weeks of quiet calculation before a single guest arrives. The right number of courses to seem generous without seeming to have spent beyond her means. The borrowed extra chairs from a neighbour returned the next morning before anyone on the street can wonder why they were needed. The soup that must be started the evening before because there is only one range and only 2 hands, hers and Alice's, to produce a meal that a wealthier household would assign to 3 or 4 people working in a proper kitchen built for exactly this purpose. She has, more than once, stood in the hallway 5 minutes before guests arrived, checked her own reflection in that same small spotted mirror we started this evening beside, and simply breathed. Once, twice, then opened the door smiling as though none of the last 6 hours had happened at all. Once it actually gets going, the evening tends to soften into something Beatrice genuinely enjoys. Conversation and candlelight, and the particular satisfaction of watching a meal she plans so carefully actually land well with the people eating it. It is only the hours before that ever feel like a performance under threat. Once the door opens and the first guest steps through it, something in her settles almost every single time into simply being a good hostess rather than anxiously rehearsing how to seem like one. Needlework actually deserves its own real attention here because it is so easy to file it away in your mind as a decorative hobby, a genteel pastime, when in fact, for a household at Beatrice's level of income, it is a serious economic activity, one that saves real money across a year in ways that mattered enormously to a family budget, without much slack in it. Clothing in this period was expensive relative to income in a way that is genuinely hard for a modern listener to fully appreciate, because we live in a world of cheap mass-produced fabric and cheap mass-produced garments, and the Victorian middle class lived in a world where a length of good wool or silk represented a meaningful chunk of a family's discretionary spending. Nothing was thrown away. A dress that had gone out of fashion was not discarded. It was unpicked at the seams, the fabric turned so the less faded inner side faced outward, and re-sewn into something current, or cut down entirely into clothes for the children. The husband's worn shirt collar was removed, turned and re-sewn so the less frayed edge showed. Beatrice spends a genuinely significant portion of her week, several hours most days, with a needle in her hand, not for pleasure exactly, though there is some real satisfaction in it, but because the alternative to her doing this work is spending money the family does not comfortably have. There is a particular kind of skill involved that I think deserves real respect. The skill of a woman who can look at a 5-year-old dress, worn at the elbows, faded at the shoulders where it caught the most light, and see in it the way a sculptor sees a figure in a block of stone, the shape of something new. A little cape for Louisa, a set of curtains for a smaller, less visible window. Even when fabric was truly past any other use, quilt pieces or cleaning rags, because nothing, genuinely nothing, was wasted in a household run on a careful budget. Mending was not simply a chore. It was in its own quiet way a form of financial management every bit as real as the account book, performed with thread instead of ink. And I want to mention something that connects to this, which is mourning, because Victorian mourning customs placed a particular, very specific burden on middle-class women that is worth understanding properly. When a family member died, and death, we should be honest, was a far more frequent visitor to Victorian households than it is to ours, infant mortality alone meant that most families experienced the death of at least one child. Mourning required specific dress, black initially, dyed or newly made, worn for a prescribed period that varied by the closeness of the relationship. A widow's mourning for her husband stretching in the strictest interpretation for as long as 2 years, moving through stages from the deepest unrelieved black of the first period to the gradual introduction of grey, mauve, or lavender in the later stages, before a full return to ordinary colours. For a household like Beatrice's, this meant that a death in the family triggered an immediate and genuinely expensive scramble, dyeing existing dresses black where possible to save the cost of new fabric, a service that specialised dyers in most towns offered specifically because the demand was so constant, or, if dyeing was not practical, finding the money for new mourning clothes at exactly the moment a family's finances were often already strained by the costs of illness and burial that had preceded the death. Grief in this world came with an invoice attached, and managing that invoice on top of managing the actual grief fell, as so much else did, to the woman of the house. There is a particular Victorian mourning object I want to describe to you because it startles people every time, in a good way, a strange, tender way. Hairwork jewellery, a small brooch, or a bracelet, or a ring, woven or plaited from the actual hair of a dead child or husband or parent, sometimes worked into intricate patterns, flowers, wreaths, a willow tree bending over a small woven urn, set behind glass or under a crystal dome no bigger than a coin. Beatrice owns one, a small oval brooch containing a plait from the son who lived 11 days, a lock cut, I imagine, by someone gentler and more practiced than her own trembling hands could have managed in that particular week. She wears it rarely, perhaps twice a year, on the child's birthday and on the anniversary of the day he died. Pinned at the collar, small enough that a caller would need to look closely to notice it at all, and closer still to understand what it actually was. I find this object almost unbearably moving, honestly, more than almost anything else we have touched on tonight, because it captures something that all the parlours and calling cards and account books, for all their careful performance, cannot quite hide. Underneath every rule about proper mourning duration and correct shades of grey moving toward lavender, underneath the whole elaborate social machinery built around grief, there is simply a woman keeping a small woven piece of her son close to her skin because it is the only part of him she has left to keep. Here is something I mentioned earlier and left hanging: the different educational paths for Frederick and Louisa. It tells you almost everything you need to know about what this entire society believed a woman's adult life was actually for. Frederick's schooling, as we said, points forward toward Latin and arithmetic, and eventually a grammar school, and eventually, if the family's fortunes hold and perhaps improve, a profession of his own, something that will let him in turn support a household exactly like the one he grew up in. Louisa's education, when it begins, will emphasize something different. Reading, certainly, and enough arithmetic to manage a household budget competently, but heavy emphasis on what the period called accomplishments: music, a little drawing, French conversation, fine needlework, deportment, the physical carriage and manner that marked a lady as a lady. The purpose of this education, stated plainly in the advice literature of the time without much embarrassment, was to prepare Louisa to be an accomplished wife and to make her marriageable to a husband of at least her own family's social standing, ideally somewhat higher. This is not a small distinction, and I do not want to breeze past it the way some tellings of this history do. Frederick's education is an investment in Frederick's own future income and independence. Louisa's education is an investment in a future husband, in making her a more attractive and more capable partner for whoever that husband turns out to be. Louisa herself, her own intellectual capacity, her own possible interests or talents that might point somewhere other than marriage, are simply not part of the equation in any way that the culture around her seriously considered. Some parents honestly, quietly resisted this pattern, taught their daughters more than the minimum, encouraged real reading, real thought, and out of households like that came the exceptional women whose names survive, the novelists, the early doctors, the reformers. But those households were the exception. deliberately swimming against a current that was very strong and very well organized, and Beatrice's household, we should be honest, is not one of them. Beatrice loves her daughter. She is also, without any particular cruelty or lack of thought, raising her for exactly the life Beatrice herself is living, because it is the only life either of them has ever been shown as a real, available possibility. I think about Louisa sometimes, this 5-year-old girl with fine tangled hair whom we met this morning, and I wonder, the way you cannot help wondering about any child in any historical story, what she might have become in a different arrangement of the world. That is not a question the history itself can answer. It simply sits there quiet, alongside everything else we know about this household. An open door that nobody in 1876 is walking through. Now health, because I think this is a subject that gets sanitized badly in a lot of popular history, made quaint and charming when the reality was often frightening in ways worth sitting with honestly, without dwelling on it so long that it disturbs your rest tonight. A doctor's visit in Beatrice's world cost real money, often several shillings for a single call, a sum that a household on £220 a year had to think about before summoning one. This meant that a huge amount of medical care, the actual front-line treatment of everyday illness, happened inside the home, administered by Beatrice herself, using a combination of genuine folk knowledge passed down through generations of women, recipes and remedies recorded in the same kind of household manuals that covered cooking and cleaning, and, it has to be said honestly, a fair amount of what we would now recognize as harmless placebo or occasionally actively harmful quackery. Patent medicines sold in bottles with confident labels and vague ingredient lists, some of which we know now from later analysis contained meaningful quantities of alcohol or opium, which perhaps explains why so many of them were so effective, at least temporarily, at calming a fretful child or a restless invalid. Childbirth itself, and I want to handle this gently because it is genuinely heavy material, was the single most dangerous event in the ordinary life of a Victorian woman of any class. Though wealth did buy some real protection, a doctor rather than only a midwife, cleaner conditions, better nutrition during pregnancy and recovery, Beatrice, when she had Frederick and then Louisa, was attended by a local midwife, a woman with real experience and real skill built over years of practice, but without access to the kind of intervention that later medicine would take for granted, and childbed fever, an infection that could follow even an apparently successful delivery, remained a real and frightening possibility right through this period, understood poorly even by trained physicians, who did not yet reliably grasp, or in many cases believe, the connection between hand-washing and infection that seems so obvious to us now. Beatrice, sitting in her parlor on a Thursday afternoon making conversation about the weather, carries this history in her body quite literally, and carries also the ordinary, unspoken awareness that any future pregnancy carries the same risk again. This is not something she discusses. It is simply there underneath the composed surface, the way so much else in this world is simply there, underneath the composed surface. I do not want to leave you with only the frightening parts of this though, because that would be its own kind of distortion. There was real tenderness in the home nursing that women like Beatrice provided, real skill built over years, real comfort given to sick children and sick husbands in the quiet hours of the night that a paid physician, arriving briefly and departing, could never fully provide. A mother sitting up through a feverish night, cool cloth pressed to a hot forehead, is a piece of history too, and I think it deserves to sit in the story alongside the harder facts, not to soften them, but simply because it is also true. Teeth, while we are on the subject of the body, were a genuine dread of this era in a way that is worth naming honestly, because dentistry such as it was offered very little beyond extraction, performed usually without any anesthetic beyond a stiff drink and a firm hand, sometimes by an actual trained dentist in a larger town, sometimes, in smaller places, by whichever local barber or blacksmith had the strongest grip and the steadiest nerve. Beatrice lost a back tooth 3 years ago to exactly this process, sitting in a wooden chair in a dentist's front room above a shop, gripping the armrests hard enough to leave marks, and she still, if you watch closely, favours that side of her mouth slightly when she eats anything particularly hard. Toothache before this point was managed at home with clove oil, a folk remedy that genuinely does have a mild numbing effect, dabbed onto the offending tooth with a twist of cotton, bought many and used many times, before finally, reluctantly, a woman in this period climbed those stairs above the shop and let the whole business be settled for good. Let me tell you about the hearth itself for a moment, because coal, more than almost any other single substance, shaped the actual physical rhythm of a day like this one, and I do not think I have given it its due yet tonight. A ton of coal, delivered every few weeks by a coalman whose face and hands never fully lost their black dusting no matter how often he washed, cost real money, and a household watched its consumption the way a modern household watches an electricity bill, though with a far more immediate, physical relationship to the thing being consumed. You could see coal, you could weigh it in a scuttle, feel its particular gritty weight, hear the specific clatter it made tumbling from bucket to grate. Alice carries coal up from the cellar perhaps 6 or 7 times across an ordinary day, a task that sounds small written down like this and is not small at all when you consider the actual distance. Stairs climbed with a filled scuttle, arms and back absorbing that weight trip after trip, soot working itself permanently into the creases of her hands no matter how thoroughly she scrubs them each evening. The parlor fire, the dining room fire, the kitchen range, sometimes a bedroom fire if illness or particular cold demands it. Each one needs feeding, each one needs its ash cleared, each one represents a small, continuous physical labour that simply does not appear anywhere in any account of what a respectable household looked like from the outside. Beatrice belongs, as most women of her standing did, to a district visiting society connected to her parish church, and on Wednesday mornings, once her own household tasks are managed, she walks, sometimes a considerable distance, into a poorer part of the town to call on a small number of families assigned to her, checking on their circumstances, bringing perhaps a little food or a small quantity of coal, offering what the period called moral guidance, which meant honestly a fair amount of instruction about cleanliness, sobriety, and proper household management delivered from a woman who had, herself, considerably more resources and considerably more security than the families she was visiting, though rarely as much as she might have liked to imagine. I think this practice deserves an honest, complicated look, rather than either simple admiration or simple condemnation, because it was genuinely both things at once. On one hand, real material help did flow through these visits, coal in cold months, small sums of money, practical advice about nursing a sick child that sometimes actually helped. On the other hand, the entire framework rested on an assumption, rarely questioned by anyone involved in giving the charity, that poverty was substantially a moral failing, a matter of insufficient thrift or insufficient sobriety, rather than a structural condition produced by wages that were simply too low, and work that was simply too unstable for a family to build any cushion against misfortune. Beatrice, visiting a woman whose husband works 12-hour days in a factory for wages that leave nothing over at the end of a week, no matter how carefully managed, genuinely believes, because everyone around her believes it, and nobody has offered her a serious alternative framework, that a little more careful budgeting on that woman's part would substantially improve her situation. It would not really, not against wages set that low. But this district visiting was also, and this matters too, one of the very few socially sanctioned activities that took a respectable woman like Beatrice out of her own house, gave her a defined public role, a sense of purpose beyond the management of her own domestic sphere, and connected her, however imperfectly, however condescendingly by our standards, to lives and struggles genuinely different from her own. Some of the women who did this work most seriously over years developed a real, clear-eyed understanding of poverty that pushed them eventually toward more active social reform, toward questioning the very assumptions they started with. Most did not go that far, but the door was there at least, cracked slightly open, in a way that the parlor and the calling cards never quite offered. Twice a year this same district visiting society organizes a charity bazaar held in the church hall, and it is worth describing because it is one of the few occasions where all the threads of Beatrice's week come together in one loud, crowded room at once. Tables line the walls, each staffed by a different lady of the parish, selling needlework the women have made across the preceding months, specifically for this purpose. Pincushions, embroidered handkerchiefs, small knitted garments for babies, sold to raise money for the Poor Relief Fund. There is a particular, slightly competitive energy to these events that nobody quite admits to out loud. Each table's takings compared afterward, quietly, by the organising committee, and Beatrice, whose needlework is genuinely skilled, takes a private, unspoken pride in knowing that her table's small embroidered items tend to sell out before most others do. The hall smells of tea urns and damp wool coats and too many bodies in too small a space, and by the end of an afternoon Beatrice's feet ache in a way that has nothing to do with standing for church and everything to do with 4 straight hours on her feet behind a trestle table, smiling, making change, wrapping small parcels in brown paper for women she half recognizes from other corners of her social world. It raises real money. It also, I think, gives her something a Thursday-at-home day never quite manages: a room full of women working visibly together towards something outside their own 4 walls, even if the framework around that work remains exactly as complicated as everything else we have discussed tonight. Church itself structured the whole week in ways that reached far beyond a single Wednesday morning of visiting. Sunday, for Beatrice's family, meant at minimum a morning service, often an evening one as well, attendance that was not merely religious observance but a genuinely important weekly demonstration of respectability, visible to the entire congregation, who noted, whether consciously or not, who was present, who looked well turned out, whose children behaved, whose pew was occupied with the same regularity week after week. Sunday clothes were kept separate from everyday clothes, brushed and pressed with particular care, and Sunday dinner, as we mentioned earlier, was the week's best meal, a small weekly performance of hospitality and abundance even in households where abundance on any other day was carefully rationed. The church itself in October holds a particular cold that Beatrice has never quite gotten used to, even after years of the same pew, the same hour, the same hymns sung slightly too slowly by a congregation that has learned, without ever discussing it, to match the organist's careful, unhurried tempo. Stone holds cold the way brick does, only longer, and by the second hymn her feet in their good boots have gone properly numb inside the building no matter how warmly she dressed leaving the house. Frederick fidgets beside her in the particular way an 8-year-old fidgets when made to sit still for an hour, and she catches his hand once without looking at him, a small silent instruction that he understands perfectly and obeys, mostly for another 10 minutes before starting again. Patience is the subject of the sermon this particular Sunday, as sermons in this particular church tend to be, delivered by a vicar who has held this parish for 11 years, and whose voice Beatrice could probably recite along with if she allowed her attention to wander, which she does not, or at least not visibly. Picture a Tuesday afternoon now, an ordinary one, no calling, no visiting. Follow Beatrice through the hours after the marketing and the cooking are done for the day, because this is where the piano comes in, and I promised we would return to it. Nearly every middle-class parlour of this period contained a piano, often bought on an instalment plan that stretched payments across 2 or 3 years, because a piano was not simply a musical instrument, it was a genuinely important piece of social signalling, evidence that a household could afford both the instrument itself and the lessons required to play it competently, and evidence specifically that the daughters of the house were being raised with the accomplishments expected of a marriageable young lady. Louisa, at 5, is still too young for serious lessons, but Beatrice herself plays, competently rather than brilliantly, the way most women of her class did, and an hour of practice most afternoons is both a genuine pleasure, one of the few unambiguously enjoyable tasks in her day, and a quiet maintenance of a skill she will need to demonstrate for guests when the occasion arises. There is something worth noticing here about the peculiar status of music in this world. A woman who played the piano too well, with too much evident skill or too much visible passion, risked seeming almost professional, almost immodest, drawing attention to herself in a way that sat uncomfortably against the ideal of feminine reticence. A woman who played competently, pleasantly, without excessive display, doing it because it was expected rather than because she was extraordinary at it, fit the mold precisely. Talent, in other words, needed to be calibrated, kept within bounds. Genuine ability held just short of anything that might look like ambition. I find that a strange, sad little detail every time I think about it, the idea of deliberately not being quite as good as you could be, because being too good would itself be a kind of social error. The piano actually pulls Beatrice's mind sideways sometimes, back 9 years, to her own wedding day, which happened in this same denomination of quiet, careful performance, though she rarely lets herself dwell on it for long. She wore her mother's veil, reworked slightly by a dressmaker to suit the current fashion, and a dress that took 11 weeks to make, mostly by her own hands and her sister's, because a wedding dress bought entirely ready-made was still, in a household like hers, considered a small extravagance most families avoided if a daughter had any skill with a needle at all, and Beatrice did. She remembers, more than the ceremony itself, which passed in the particular blur that most people report about their own weddings, the morning before it, sitting at her mother's dressing table while her sister pinned her hair, both of them laughing about something neither of them could later recall. The last hour of her life in which she was, in the eyes of the law and of the church and of everyone she knew, simply herself and not yet anyone's wife. That thought used to feel sadder to her, she has told me. Well, she has not told me anything, obviously. She is not real in the way you and I are real tonight. But if she were, if I could ask her, I suspect she would say something like this, that the sadness of it dulled with time, the way most things do. And what replaced it was not resignation exactly, more a kind of settled clarity about what marriage in her world actually was. A partnership built on defined roles rather than equal ones. Imperfect, often genuinely warm, and never, not for one single day since, entirely her own. After music, if the light is still good, Beatrice often reads, and reading in this household is itself a carefully managed activity, not because reading was discouraged exactly, but because what a respectable woman read mattered enormously to how she was perceived. Serious novels, particularly the sensation novels that were enormously popular, and enormously scandalous in roughly equal measure, walked a careful line, and a woman seen reading certain authors too openly, too enthusiastically, might invite quiet judgment from other women at church. Beatrice tends towards safer choices, moral improvement literature, religious writing, the more respectable end of the fiction being published, and she reads more often than not with half an ear listening for Alice in the kitchen, or for the children upstairs, because even this, even the single hour of the day that most closely resembles leisure in the way we would recognize it, is never entirely free of the household's ongoing demands on her attention. I do not think Beatrice experiences this the way I am describing it, analytically, as a kind of constant background vigilance. It is simply how her mind works, has always worked, the way a lighthouse keeper's mind stays partly attuned to the weather even while doing something else entirely. Now let us talk about Monday, because Monday in almost every household in England, regardless of class, meant washing day, and washing day deserves real attention, because it was, without much competition, the single most physically brutal day of the domestic week, and understanding it properly changes how you think about everything else we have discussed so far. In a household like Beatrice's, with one servant, washing day could not simply be handed entirely to Alice, because the labour involved was so extensive that it genuinely required more than one pair of hands working most of a day, sometimes with help brought in specifically for the purpose, a washerwoman hired for the day at a shilling or two, someone from a poorer part of town who made a hard living moving from house to house, doing exactly this work week after week. The process itself, if you have never had it described to you in any detail, is worth walking through slowly, because it explains so much about why this single day casts such a long shadow over the rest of the week. Water first had to be heated, enormous quantities of it, in a copper boiler set into the scullery or an outbuilding, over a fire that itself had to be built and fed and tended for hours. Clothes and linens were sorted, the whitest items washed first in the cleanest water, working down through less delicate fabrics as the water grew progressively dirtier and greyer. Washing itself meant scrubbing by hand against a corrugated washboard, wringing heavy wet fabric by hand or through a mangle, a device with two rollers turned by a hand crank that squeezed water out of fabric before it went to dry, a task that was exhausting on the arms and shoulders in a way that is genuinely hard to appreciate until you have tried to wring out even a single heavy wet sheet by hand yourself. Then rinsing, sometimes multiple times, then more wringing, then hanging to dry, weather permitting, or draped over racks near the kitchen fire if the weather did not cooperate, which filled the house with damp, heavy air and the particular smell of wet wool and wet cotton drying slowly indoors. Beatrice's hands, on a Monday evening, are red and cracked from the lye soap and the hot water and the hours of physical labour in a way that no amount of cold cream applied that night will fully hide by Tuesday. This is a detail I find genuinely important to sit with, because it cuts directly against any lingering image of the delicate, untouched Victorian lady. The reality at Beatrice's level of the middle class is a woman whose hands, at least one day a week, look very much like the hands of the washerwoman she has hired to help her, doing very much the same work, side by side, for the same number of hours, even though the social gulf between the mistress of the house and the hired washerwoman remains, in every other respect, absolute and unbridgeable. They might work an entire day together, elbow to elbow over the same tub of grey water, and at the end of it, Beatrice goes back to being the lady of the house and the washerwoman goes back to being paid help, and neither of them, most likely, ever says out loud what must surely have occurred to both of them at some point during that long, wet, exhausting day, which is how strange it is that the same labour means such entirely different things depending on who is doing it and why. Ironing day follows washing day, usually Tuesday, and while it lacks the sheer brute physical scale of Monday's labour, it carries its own particular difficulties, chief among them heat and precision in roughly equal measure. Irons in this period were solid pieces of cast metal, heated directly on the kitchen range, and a household doing any serious amount of ironing kept several going at once, one in use while another reheated, because a single iron cooled too quickly against fabric to be efficient on its own. Testing the heat correctly, hot enough to press effectively but not so hot as to scorch a good shirt or, worse, a fine piece of linen that had taken hours to launder properly, required a real practiced skill, usually tested by holding the iron near the cheek or by a quick touch to a damp finger, listening for the particular hiss that told an experienced woman exactly what she needed to know. Beatrice, or more often Alice under Beatrice's supervision, spent hours at this task, moving between the heat of the range and the ironing board, arms and shoulders aching by evening in a different way than Monday's washing had ached them, a more concentrated, repetitive strain rather than the full-body exhaustion of the washtub. Louisa's hair from this morning deserves one more small mention before we move on, because it comes back around every single evening in a way that quietly bookends the day. Before bed, Beatrice unplaits it again, brushes it out, and rebraids it loosely for the night. The same careful, patient handling that started her morning, now closing it. Louisa is usually half asleep by the second or third stroke of the brush, her head heavy against Beatrice's arm, and there is a particular, wordless tenderness in this exchange that nothing about calling cards or account books or the whole elaborate architecture of respectability ever quite touches. Just a mother's hands in her daughter's hair. Morning and night, the two fixed points a whole complicated day gets strung between. I mention this partly because I think the sheer weak-structured nature of Victorian domestic labour, wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday, marketing and mending woven through the other days, bread baked on a fixed schedule, silver cleaned on its own appointed day, tells you something important about how differently time itself functioned in this world compared to ours. We tend to think of household chores today as flexible, fitted around a schedule set by paid work or by personal preference. In Beatrice's world, the household itself had a fixed weekly liturgy almost, a rhythm as regular and as unquestioned as the church calendar that structured the year, and deviating from it, doing the washing on a Wednesday instead of a Monday because of some disruption, was not simply an inconvenience but a small, faintly troubling break in the natural order of things, the kind of small disorder that a careful housewife took some quiet pride in never allowing to happen. Let me tell you something about candles and lamps too, because light itself, something we barely think about at all today, structured a genuine and real portion of the household's expenses and Beatrice's daily calculations. Gaslighting had reached many middle-class homes by the 1870s, at least in the more prosperous towns and certainly in London, but gas was expensive to run continuously, and a careful household used it selectively, lit in the rooms actually occupied, extinguished the moment a room emptied, a habit so deeply ingrained that Beatrice would notice, with real irritation, if Alice left a gas jet burning in an empty hallway where gas had not reached, or in rooms considered not important enough to warrant it. Oil lamps and candles did the work instead, each with its own small economy of wicks trimmed, oil measured, candle stubs saved and melted down rather than thrown away when they grew too short to hold comfortably. The quality of light in this house, in other words, was not a constant ambient thing the way it is for us, available at the flip of a switch without a single thought given to its cost. It was a resource metered and considered, brighter in some rooms and dimmer in others depending entirely on what the household could justify spending, and evenings, once the light began to fail in October, took on a particular quality of gathered, careful brightness in whichever room the family occupied together, everyone drawn close to the one well-lit space in an otherwise dim and increasingly cold house. I want to talk now about Alice again, because we have mostly seen her from Beatrice's point of view so far, as a resource, a set of hands helping manage the household, and I think that framing, while historically accurate to how Beatrice herself would have understood the relationship, leaves out something worth restoring, which is Alice's own experience of this same house. Alice rises before anyone else in the household and goes to bed after everyone else has settled, in a small attic room that is, in nearly every respect, colder and more sparsely furnished than any room the family itself occupies. She eats her meals more often than not standing in the kitchen or seated briefly at a small table there, separately from the family, a physical separation that mirrors and reinforces the social separation running through every other part of the day. She has one afternoon off most weeks, and one Sunday off perhaps once a month, and she sends most of her modest wages home to her mother, keeping very little for herself, because the household she grew up in needs the money more than she does, and this is simply understood without much discussion as part of what it means to be the eldest daughter sent into service. And yet the relationship between Alice and Beatrice, I think, was often more complicated, more genuinely human than a purely economic description would suggest. And it is worth resisting the temptation to flatten it into either pure exploitation on one side or pure gratitude on the other, because the reality in most households sat somewhere more tangled in between. Beatrice depends on Alice completely, in a very literal sense, could not maintain her household or her own social position without her, and there is real evidence, in surviving letters and diaries from women in exactly this position, that many mistresses developed genuine, if unequal, affection for servants who stayed with them for years, worried over their health, helped them when they were sick, wrote references that mattered enormously to a servant's future prospects, and in some cases maintained contact for years after a servant had married and left service entirely. None of this erases the fundamental inequality of the arrangement, the enormous gap in security, wages, and freedom between the two women sharing this house. But history, real history, is rarely as clean as either the sentimental version or the purely critical version would like it to be. And I think Beatrice and Alice's relationship, whatever its exact texture in this particular imagined household, probably held both things at once, real interdependence and real inequality, real occasional warmth and real structural unfairness, sitting side by side without either one cancelling the other out. There is a phrase that turns up again and again in the household advice literature aimed at mistresses, urging them to treat their servants with what the books call firm kindness, a phrase that captures, probably better than the authors intended, the genuinely uncomfortable balancing act at the heart of this relationship. Kindness, but never so much that it blurred the line of authority. Firmness, but never so harsh that it drove away a good girl who was, after all, difficult and expensive to replace. Beatrice manages this balance daily, the way she manages the household budget, the way she manages her own appearance of leisure over her actual labour. One more quiet, continuous act of calibration in a life that seems, the more closely you examine it, to be built almost entirely out of exactly this kind of calibration. I wonder sometimes what happens to a girl like Alice, further down the road than tonight's story goes. Most maids of all work did not stay in service forever. A good number left to marry, often a tradesman or a skilled workman met through a chapel or a family connection, carrying with them into their own much smaller households an intimate, thorough knowledge of exactly how a respectable home was supposed to run, learnt not from any book but from years of doing it with her own hands under someone else's roof. Some stayed in service for decades, rising eventually, if the household was large enough to offer the position, to housekeeper, a genuine position of real authority over an entire staff. A woman who had once scrubbed floors herself, now instructing younger girls in exactly how it should be done. And some, and this is the harder ending, simply grew older in service without ever marrying or advancing, increasingly less employable as their strength declined, increasingly dependent on the goodwill of whichever family they had most recently served, because there was no pension waiting for a servant at the end of her working life, no institution built to catch her, only whatever savings she had managed to send home less of than she needed to, and whatever charity a former employer might, out of genuine affection or simple obligation, choose to extend. Alice is 19 tonight, and none of this has happened to her yet. She is right now simply a girl kneeling in front of a range at 6 in the morning, clearing yesterday's ash, thinking, if she is thinking about anything beyond the task in front of her, about the letter she wants to write her mother this Sunday, and whether there will be enough daylight left after church to actually write it. Letters are worth pausing on too, because before the telephone existed in any ordinary household, and it did not exist in Beatrice's for decades yet, the letter was the primary instrument of maintaining relationships that distance had interrupted. A sister married and moved to another town, a cousin gone out to India with a husband in the colonial service, a school friend now living in a different city entirely. Beatrice writes several letters most weeks, sitting at the same small desk where she keeps her accounts, and letter writing, like so much else in her day, operated under its own set of unspoken rules about what could and could not be said. A cheerful tone was expected almost regardless of actual circumstances, complaints kept mild and brief, difficulties mentioned only obliquely if at all, because a letter, unlike a private diary, was understood to be a kind of small public document, potentially read aloud to other family members, potentially kept and reread for years, and a woman's correspondence, taken as a whole, was itself a reflection of her character and her household stability, in exactly the same way her parlor or her calling manner was. One of those letters this particular month is a longer, harder one than usual, addressed to a younger brother who emigrated to Melbourne 3 years ago, chasing better prospects than a crowded English trade offered him at home. Letters to Australia took the better part of 2 months to arrive, sometimes longer, and answers took another 2 coming back, which meant that any actual conversation between Beatrice and her brother unfolded across the better part of a year, questions answered long after they had stopped mattering in quite the same way, news of a birth or an illness landing months after the fact, softened or sharpened by all that distance and delay. She writes to him anyway, faithfully, 4 times a year, describing Frederick's growth and Louisa's small sayings in enough detail that a man on the other side of the world might feel, for the length of one letter at least, a little less far away than he actually is. This meant that an enormous amount of real difficulty in Beatrice's life, and in the lives of the women she corresponded with, simply never appears in the written record that survives from this period, tucked away in archives and family collections that historians now pore over looking for exactly the kind of honest, unguarded detail that the letters were specifically designed never to contain. When historians say, as they sometimes do, that we know surprisingly little about the interior emotional lives of ordinary middle-class Victorian women, compared to how much we know about their daily schedules and their household economics, this is a large part of why. The schedules survive because keeping records of schedules and expenses was itself a respectable, sanctioned activity, meant to be kept and shown if necessary. The emotional interior survives far more rarely, because expressing it, even in a private letter, ran against the deep grain of what this culture believed a composed, respectable woman should do with her feelings, which was, more often than not, simply carry them without complaint and without much record. Diaries, where they survive and where a woman felt safe enough to be more honest in them than in her letters, occasionally give us a crack of light into this hidden interior, and the ones that historians have studied most closely reveal exactly the kind of exhaustion, quiet resentment, occasional real joy, and persistent low-grade anxiety about money and appearances that this entire episode has been trying to describe. One diary from a woman in almost exactly Beatrice's position, kept across several years in the 1870s, records, among hundreds of entries about the weather and the children's health, a single line, written on what seems to have been an especially difficult day, that reads something like this: that she was tired in a way that sleep did not seem to fix. I think about that line more than I probably should. It says almost nothing on its surface, and it says almost everything underneath it. I wonder sometimes what Beatrice's own diary might say if she kept one, which she does not really, beyond the account book that records pounds and shillings but never quite records her. Perhaps that is its own kind of answer. Perhaps a life this full of managing everyone else's comfort simply does not leave much room, most nights, for the private accounting of anything else. Not every outlet for a mind like Beatrice's was closed off entirely, though, and I want to be fair to the period here rather than only telling the confined half of the story. Reading circles, sometimes called mutual improvement societies, met in parlours very much like hers, small groups of women gathering fortnightly or monthly to read aloud from history, or poetry, or occasionally, carefully, a scientific topic thought suitable for a general audience, followed by discussion that, by every surviving account, could grow genuinely lively, genuinely sharp, women disagreeing with real conviction about a poem's meaning or a historical figure's character, in a room where, an hour earlier, they had been discussing nothing more contentious than the weather. Beatrice belongs to one such group, meeting on alternating Tuesdays at a rotating series of houses, and I think it is worth saying that this, more than almost anything else in her week, is where something like her actual intellect gets any exercise at all, unfiltered by the performance of gentility that governs a calling afternoon. She looks forward to these Tuesdays with a specific, private eagerness that she does not quite show even to Edmund, because there is something in it that belongs only to her. A room full of women who read the same book she read and thought their own real thoughts about it, and are prepared, for one evening every fortnight, to say so out loud. There was a phrase used constantly and with real anxiety throughout the middle-class press and the household advice books of this period: the servant problem, and it tells you something important about how precarious this entire arrangement actually felt from the inside, even though from a modern perspective it can look, at first glance, like a comfortable and stable social system. The servant problem referred to a persistent, widely discussed concern among the middle classes that good servants, meaning reliable, skilled, honest domestic workers willing to work for the wages a middle-class household could actually offer, were becoming harder and harder to find as the century wore on, Industrial jobs in factories, and later, toward the end of the century, new opportunities in shops and offices offered working-class women defined hours, sometimes better pay, and critically, an evening and a Sunday that genuinely belonged to them rather than to an employer's household around the clock. Domestic service, by comparison, however respectable it was considered, meant living under someone else's roof, on someone else's schedule, with very little personal time and very little personal space. And as alternatives slowly opened up, fewer young women were eager to take positions like Alice's. For a household like Beatrice's, this meant that finding and keeping a good maid of all work required real, ongoing effort. Registry offices where servants seeking positions and families seeking servants could find each other, careful attention to references, and a genuine, practical incentive to treat a good servant reasonably well, because losing her meant weeks or months of managing the entire household without help, while a replacement was found, trained, and integrated into the specific habits and preferences of the family, a process that was itself exhausting and disruptive. Beatrice's own mother, a generation earlier, could reasonably expect a servant to stay for a decade or more. Beatrice cannot assume anything like that with the same confidence, and this quiet, gradually shifting instability, this awareness that the labour underpinning her entire social performance was becoming less reliable and more contested with every passing year, sits underneath the surface of her days like a low, persistent hum, rarely spoken of directly, but never entirely absent either. Alice gets one Sunday afternoon off a month, and I like to think, though the record can only take me so far here, about what she actually does with it. Walks, sometimes, with another maid from a house 2 streets over, both of them still in their good dresses from morning church, free for a few hours of nobody's schedule but their own. Perhaps a letter written to her mother in the village, the one she keeps meaning to send, and often does not manage until the following month. Perhaps simply sitting somewhere quiet, doing absolutely nothing at all, which for a girl who spends 6 days a week in almost constant motion might be the rarest luxury in her entire week. There is something almost poignant in this when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. The entire structure of middle-class Victorian respectability depended on a supply of cheap, reliable domestic labour that the culture largely refused to properly value, pay, or even acknowledge as skilled work. And as soon as the working-class women who provided that labour gained even slightly better alternatives, the whole system began to wobble. Beatrice, sitting anxiously in her parlour wondering whether Alice might be tempted away by a factory position with better hours, is experiencing in a small personal domestic way the early tremors of an economic shift that would eventually reshape the entire domestic world she has spent her whole adult life learning to manage. She does not know this, of course. She simply knows that good girls are harder to find than they used to be, and that this worries her in the quiet, practical, unglamorous way that most real historical change actually feels from the inside, long before anyone writing about it later gives it a proper name. I mentioned the corset earlier, and I want to come back to it properly because clothing itself is one of those Victorian details that has accumulated so much modern mythology around it that the actual historical reality tends to get lost underneath. The popular image, the woman fainting from a corset laced to a scandalously small waist, gasping for breath, existed, but it belonged overwhelmingly to a narrow, fashionable, wealthy slice of society, with the leisure and the lady's maid necessary to achieve and maintain that kind of extreme, tightly managed silhouette. Beatrice's corset, the one she laces herself most mornings using that slightly awkward front and back technique we talked about earlier, is a much more practical garment, providing support and the expected silhouette without approaching anything like the extremes associated with high fashion. She needs to be able to bend, to reach into a hot oven, to carry a basket of marketing, to kneel occasionally to attend to a child, and a corset laced to the point of genuine physical impairment would simply make her actual daily labour impossible. Fashion, in other words, adapted itself to function at Beatrice's level of society in a way it did not have to for a woman whose entire day was designed around leisure rather than labour. The rest of her wardrobe follows the same logic. Dark, practical colours that hide dirt and wear, fabrics chosen for durability as much as appearance, dresses cut to allow real movement, because a woman who cooks, cleans, minds children, and walks to market several times a week in the same garments cannot afford clothing designed purely for display. And yet, and this is the part that circles back to everything we have already discussed tonight, these same practical clothes still had to signal respectability, still had to look appropriately genteel, still had to distinguish Beatrice visually and immediately from a working-class woman doing broadly similar physical tasks in broadly similar practical clothing. The distinctions were subtle sometimes, the quality of the fabric, the neatness of the trim, the presence of gloves and a proper bonnet when out in public, but they were real, and everyone in this world, at every level of society, could read them instantly, the way we might instantly clock the difference between two seemingly similar jackets based on a logo or a cut that most people outside a particular context would never even notice. Take gloves, for instance. A respectable woman did not appear outdoors without them, not because her hands were cold, though sometimes they were, but because bare hands in public carried a faint suggestion of the labouring classes, hands roughened by work and therefore hands with nothing to hide and nothing to protect. Beatrice's gloves are kid leather, mended more than once at the fingertips by her own careful stitching, because a new pair cost real money and a small tear, caught early, could be repaired invisibly enough that only she would ever know it was there. And her bonnet, its shape and trim adjusted year by year to track the current fashion just closely enough to avoid looking dated without ever chasing it closely enough to look extravagant. A narrow, exhausting needle to thread season after season on a budget that did not really allow for chasing anything at all. I find this whole system of visual signalling genuinely fascinating, actually. The sheer density of information encoded into something as apparently simple as a woman's daily walking dress. Fabric, cut, colour, condition, accessories, all of it working together constantly, silently, to announce exactly where a woman stood in a hierarchy that everyone around her had been trained since childhood to read fluently and instantly, the way we read a room today without consciously analysing it. Beatrice dresses every single morning inside this dense web of unspoken meaning, and she does it, for the most part, without any particular sense of how strange or how constructed the whole system actually is. It is simply how the world works. It has always been how the world works as far as she has ever known. Somewhere around 4, before any of that, there is tea, and I do not mean the elaborate tiered afternoon tea that later decades and later marketing turned into a whole aesthetic of its own. Beatrice's tea is smaller, quieter, taken alone most days, a single cup made with leaves measured carefully from a locked caddy, because tea was genuinely expensive enough through much of this period that many households kept it under lock and key, the mistress herself controlling the small brass key on a chain, rather than trusting even a good servant with unrestricted access to it. A slice of bread and butter, perhaps, if she is hungry, taken sitting by the window with whatever needlework or reading occupies her hands. And this is, more than almost any other single moment in her day, purely and simply hers. No calling, no children needing attention yet, no account book, 15 minutes, perhaps 20, of tea going gently cold in a cup while the light outside starts, very slowly, to turn the particular grey-gold colour that October afternoons turn in this part of the world. By 5 in the afternoon, the light already beginning to fail in October, the household starts to shift its attention toward evening, and this shift has its own small rituals worth noticing. Alice begins the dinner preparations in earnest, building up the range fire again, and Beatrice, if the day has been an ordinary one without callers or particular disruptions, will often use this last hour of daylight to check over Frederick's schoolwork, sitting with him at the dining table while he works through his sums or recites whatever passage of scripture or poetry he has been set to memorize, correcting his errors with a patience that, if we are honest, probably varies quite a bit depending on how the rest of her day has gone. Louisa, too young yet for formal lessons, sits nearby with a slate of her own, copying letters, or plays quietly with a rag doll that Beatrice made her the previous Christmas, sewn from fabric scraps left over from other projects, because even a child's toy in this household tends to be an object of careful economical reuse rather than a separate purchased item. Edmund returns a little after 6, tired in the particular flat, sedentary way of a man who has spent 10 hours at a desk rather than on his feet, and there is a small quiet ritual to his homecoming too. His coat and hat taken by Alice at the door, his boots exchanged for house slippers kept warming near the fire, a cup of tea or, depending on the household's habits, something slightly stronger waiting for him in the sitting room while dinner finishes its final preparation. Dinner itself, the main meal of the day for this household, taken in the early evening rather than at the later hour fashionable among the wealthy, is a modest but respectable affair, a joint of meat if the week's budget has allowed for it, vegetables, bread, followed perhaps by a simple pudding, eaten at the dining table with the children present, because this household cannot afford the separate nursery dining arrangements that wealthier families maintained, and Frederick and Louisa are expected to sit quietly, speak when spoken to, and demonstrate the table manners that Beatrice has spent considerable effort teaching them, because a child's behaviour at table, like everything else in this world, reflects directly on the mother who raised him. Tonight it is a small shoulder of mutton, roasted slowly through the afternoon while Beatrice moved between it and everything else the day required. Carrots and potatoes from the same morning's marketing, a gravy made from the pan drippings and thickened carefully, tasted twice, adjusted once. Bread cut at the table by Edmund himself, one small domestic task that remains his and only his, a habit from his own father's house that neither of them has ever quite examined or thought to change. A baked apple pudding after, sweetened lightly because sugar too has its price and its place in the account book, and the whole meal takes perhaps 40 minutes from the first plate to the last, unhurried but not lingering, the particular rhythm of a family that eats together most evenings and has long since stopped needing to fill every silence. Conversation over dinner tends toward Edmund's day, recounted in the kind of detail that Beatrice has learned to listen to with apparently genuine interest regardless of how repetitive the office politics of an insurance clerk's daily grind might actually become across years of marriage, and toward the children's small achievements and small troubles. A spelling test passed, a scraped knee tended to, the ordinary texture of family life that, underneath all the social performance and financial anxiety we have spent this whole evening examining, remains genuinely, recognizably familiar across 150 years. Beatrice rarely mentions her own day in any detail, not out of secrecy exactly, but because the habit of not discussing her own labour, of treating it as simply the invisible background against which everyone else's day happens, is by now so deeply ingrained that it would probably not even occur to her that there was much to tell. After dinner in a household like this one, family prayers were a genuinely common practice, not merely for the devout, but as a broadly expected part of respectable domestic life. And Beatrice's family gathers most evenings in the sitting room, Edmund reading a short passage of scripture and leading a brief prayer, the children required to sit still and attentive through it. Alice, too, often called in from the kitchen to join this brief evening observance, a small daily reminder that the household, whatever its internal hierarchies and divisions, understood itself as a single unit bound together under a shared religious framework. This detail matters, I think, because it complicates any picture of the Victorian household as purely a machine of class division and economic calculation. There was genuinely, alongside all of that, a real sense of shared moral and spiritual community that this evening ritual reinforced, however imperfectly it may have addressed the actual inequalities running underneath it. The children go up to bed around 7, Louisa first, then Frederick a little later, and this too falls almost entirely to Beatrice. The washing of faces and hands, the nightgowns, the hearing of a simple prayer said at the bedside, the tucking in, the brief moment of quiet before the candle is taken away and the child left to settle into sleep. I think there is something worth noticing in how much of Beatrice's day, start to finish, from Louisa's tangled hair at 6 in the morning to Louisa's bedtime prayer at 7 at night, is bounded by this same quiet, continuous physical and emotional labour of child-rearing, threaded through and around everything else we have discussed tonight. The accounts, the marketing, the calling, the needlework, the washing, all of it happening in the gaps and margins around the constant, low-level work of simply keeping two small children fed, clean, educated and loved through each ordinary day. Once the children are settled, Beatrice and Edmund have what amounts to their only real stretch of private time together, an hour or two in the sitting room before bed. I want to say honestly that this hour, for many couples in exactly this position, held real warmth, real companionship, the accumulated ease of two people who have built a shared life together across years, and who genuinely, whatever the structural inequalities of their respective positions, care for each other. Edmund reads, Beatrice sews, always sews, because idle hands, even in this last private hour of the day, remain slightly suspect, a habit so deep it has become simply comfortable rather than dutiful. They talk, sometimes about the children, sometimes about a piece of news from the paper, sometimes about nothing in particular, the easy low-stakes conversation of people who do not need to perform for each other the way they perform for everyone else. This is not nothing. In a life built so extensively around visible, managed appearance, this hour, unwitnessed, unassessed by any caller or any neighbour, is one of the very few genuinely private spaces Beatrice occupies all day, and I suspect, though the historical record can only gesture at this rather than confirm it directly, that hours like this one were where a great deal of the real, sustaining warmth of these marriages actually lived. Something bigger comes into view if we step back now and think about the larger shape of a life like Beatrice's, because everything we have discussed so far has stayed close to a single ordinary week, and I want to widen the lens a little before we come back in close again. Beatrice married Edmund when she was 22 and he was 26, a fairly typical age for a middle-class marriage of this period, and the courtship that preceded it followed its own careful, heavily supervised choreography, chaperoned visits, carefully worded letters, exchanged under the watchful, approving eye of both families. A period of engagement lasting perhaps a year, while Edmund secured his position at the bank and demonstrated, to the satisfaction of Beatrice's father, that he could adequately support a household. Love, in the modern romantic sense we tend to project backward onto every historical marriage, was certainly present and certainly mattered, but it operated alongside and was expected to develop within a framework of practical assessment that strikes many modern listeners as almost transactional, though I would gently push back on that word, because I think what was actually happening was less a cold transaction and more a different, more communal understanding of what marriage was fundamentally for, an understanding that made room for affection to grow inside a structure built primarily around economic and social stability, rather than expecting affection alone to somehow generate that stability on its own. Since her marriage, Beatrice has been pregnant 4 times, not 2, and this is a detail worth sitting with honestly rather than glossing over, because it reflects one of the harder, quieter realities of this world. Between Frederick and Louisa there was a pregnancy that ended in miscarriage in its 5th month, an event that was, by the standards of the time, spoken of only obliquely, mourned largely in private, without the kind of open grief support that we would now consider appropriate and necessary. And after Louisa there was a 3rd child, a boy, who lived 11 days before succumbing to what the doctor called, in the vague diagnostic language common to the period, a weakness of the constitution, a phrase that tells us essentially nothing about the actual medical cause and everything about how limited medical understanding of infant illness still was even by the later decades of the century. Beatrice does not speak of this child often. There is a small grave in the parish churchyard, with his name and the single word beloved carved beneath it, and she visits it quietly, alone, perhaps once a month, a private ritual that exists entirely outside the visible, performed structure of her days. One of the very few things she does purely for herself, without any audience at all, without any social function to fulfill. I mention this not to dwell on sorrow for its own sake tonight, because that runs against everything this channel is trying to do, which is help you rest, not unsettle you. But I think leaving it out entirely would be its own kind of dishonesty, a soft focus version of this history that flattens out something real and true about what it meant to raise a family in this period. Contraception, plainly, was neither reliable nor widely discussed among respectable married couples of this class. Information about it circulating mostly through underground, often disreputable channels that a woman like Beatrice would have had very limited access to and might well have considered improper to seek out, even if she had known where to look. Family size, in other words, was substantially outside a woman's control in a way that is genuinely difficult for many people today to fully internalize, and the emotional weight of that lack of control, the repeated cycle of pregnancy, birth, and sometimes loss, threading through a decade or more of a woman's adult life, sits quietly underneath so much of what we have discussed tonight, present in every account of Victorian domesticity, even when it goes almost entirely unmentioned in the record itself. The shape of a life like Beatrice's tends to shift too briefly as the years accumulate, and it shifts in ways worth understanding. As Frederick and Louisa grow older, the household's expenses shift with them, school fees increasing as Frederick approaches the age for a proper grammar school, the beginnings of thought, still years away but already occasionally discussed quietly between Beatrice and Edmund in their evening hour together, about what profession he might eventually enter. The law, the church, perhaps something in trade if the family's fortunes allow for the capital such a venture would require. Louisa's future, as we discussed, points toward marriage, and Beatrice, as her daughter grows, will take on a new role many mothers of this period took extremely seriously, that of carefully managing Louisa's entry into the same social world Beatrice herself has spent her adult life navigating, teaching her the calling card etiquette, the needlework, the careful modulation of talent and reticence at the piano, essentially training her own eventual replacement in a system that will, if all goes reasonably well, see Louisa married by her early 20s into a household not unlike the one she grew up in. If Edmund's career progresses well, and bank clerks of solid, steady competence often did see gradual advancement across a working life, the household circumstances might improve modestly across the coming decade, perhaps eventually allowing for a second servant, easing some of the physical burden that falls on Beatrice today, perhaps a slightly larger house, a slightly more comfortable margin in the account book that currently requires such careful daily management. This was, in fact, one of the real animating hopes running underneath middle-class Victorian domestic life, the sense that respectability maintained carefully now, connections cultivated patiently through years of calling and church attendance and correct behavior, would compound gradually into genuine security and perhaps even modest prosperity by the time a couple reached their 50s. Frederick, for his part, has already announced, with the total confidence only an 8-year-old can summon, that he intends to be an engineer and build bridges, a career that did not exist in any formal sense when his own father was his age, and that represents, in its own small way, exactly the kind of upward, modernizing ambition this whole household quietly orients itself around. Edmund finds this endlessly amusing, and encourages it anyway, half joking over dinner about the bridges Frederick will build, though there is something underneath the joke, I think, that is not really a joke at all. A father who left school at 14 himself, watching his son dream in an entirely different scale. But there is a harder possibility worth naming honestly too, because this is real history, and real history does not always resolve toward comfort. If Edmund were to die from illness, from an accident, from any of the ordinary hazards of 19th century life that could end a working man's life without much warning, Beatrice's position would become genuinely precarious very quickly. Life insurance existed, and a responsible clerk of Edmund's position might well carry a modest policy, but widowhood for a middle-class woman without independent means of her own, without property in her own name, under the property laws that prevailed through most of this period, without any expectation that she herself might simply go out and earn an equivalent income, could mean a rapid, frightening slide down the social ladder her entire life had been organized around maintaining. I should say something here about the law itself, because it explains a great deal of what sits underneath this whole precariousness. For most of Beatrice's married life, a wife's legal identity was substantially absorbed into her husband's, a doctrine with the old Latin name of covertura, under which almost anything she owned before marriage, or earned during it, became legally his to control. This began to shift only in 1870, 6 years before tonight's story, when a new Act of Parliament allowed married women to keep wages they earned themselves and certain kinds of property that came to them directly, a change significant enough that women across the country discussed it at length in exactly the kind of reading circle Beatrice attends, though it would take another decade and more beyond it before the law caught up any further. Beatrice has read about this act. She understands in a general way that something has shifted, even if she could not have told you before tonight exactly which year or exactly what it changed and what it left untouched. Genteel poverty, the particular quietly desperate condition of a woman who retained all the manners, all the expectations, and all the social pressures of respectability while losing the income that had made maintaining it possible, was a real and recognized category of Victorian hardship, discussed with a kind of hushed, anxious sympathy in the letters and diaries of women who watched it happen to friends, neighbors, sisters, and who understood with a clarity that must have been genuinely frightening to sit with, how thin the margin actually was between the comfortable, composed life Beatrice leads today and a very different one that a single bad turn of fortune could bring. Some of this, I promised you at the start of tonight, would surprise you, and I want to make good on that properly now, because there are a handful of facts about this ordinary, respectable, quietly striving household that genuinely do startle people the first time they hear them, and I think they deserve a proper telling rather than a passing mention. The first concerns something as innocent seeming as wallpaper, a particular shade of vivid green, wildly fashionable through much of the middle decades of the century, achieved its brilliant colour through a compound containing arsenic, and this was not some obscure or rare product. It was everywhere, in middle-class parlours exactly like Beatrice's, on nursery walls, on the very wallpaper that Louisa and Frederick fall asleep beside each night. As the paper aged and grew slightly damp, as most walls in an English climate eventually do, it could release the compound into the air in small quantities, and there were documented cases reported with growing alarm in the medical press of the period of household members suffering mysterious, chronic ill health that doctors eventually traced back to nothing more sinister than the colour of the walls around them. Beatrice's own parlour, the room she is so careful to keep dusted and composed for visitors, might well be papered in exactly this fashionable, faintly poisonous green, and she would have absolutely no way of knowing it, because the connection between the wallpaper and the illness was, for much of this period, simply not yet understood or widely accepted. The second fact concerns something even closer to home and considerably harder to hear, which is the medicine given to fretful, teething or colicky infants throughout this period, a preparation widely available and widely trusted, sold under names like Godfrey's Cordial, containing a genuinely significant quantity of opium in the form of laudanum, mixed with treacle to make it palatable to a small child. This was not a fringe or disreputable product. It was recommended in respectable household manuals, sold openly by chemists, and used with real trust and real good intention by mothers across every level of society, including women exactly like Beatrice, desperate for a few hours of quiet sleep after a long day and genuinely unaware, because the medical understanding of infant physiology and drug tolerance was so limited that they were administering a substance capable of causing serious harm, and in a documented tragic number of cases across the country, causing infant death from what was essentially an overdose given in complete innocence by a loving, exhausted parent, following exactly the advice the era's most trusted sources had given her. I tell you this not to frighten you before sleep, and please let it settle rather than spike, because I think there is something important in it beyond the shock value alone. It reframes the entire picture we have built tonight. Beatrice is not simply performing respectability inside a stable, safe, well-understood domestic world. She is managing a household, raising children, making daily decisions about health and safety, inside a world where the basic science underlying so many of her most caring, most well-intentioned choices was still dangerously incomplete, where the products she trusted, the wallpaper she chose because it was fashionable, the cordial she gave because a doctor's manual recommended it, could carry hidden costs that neither she nor anyone advising her had any real way of detecting. That, I think, is its own kind of quiet tragedy, layered underneath everything else we have discussed. The tragedy of genuine care operating with incomplete information, doing its careful, earnest best inside a world that had not yet caught up to what it needed to know to keep its most vulnerable members fully safe. Let me tell you about one more thing that surprises people, something smaller in scale but I think equally revealing about the pressures running underneath this whole world, and that is the sheer density of social surveillance that a woman in Beatrice's position lived inside every single day. We have talked about calling cards and at-home days as a kind of formal, structured social system, but underneath that formal system ran a constant, informal current of observation and comment among the women of a given neighborhood, a current with real teeth, capable of genuinely damaging a family's standing if it turned against them. Servants gossiped between households, comparing notes on their respective mistresses at the shops or over the garden wall. And word of a household running short of money, a child improperly dressed, a husband seen somewhere he should not have been, travelled through this informal network with a speed that would put certain modern social platforms to shame. Beatrice knows this. Every woman in her position knows this. It is part of why the performance we have spent this whole evening describing has to be so relentlessly consistent, because a single slip, glimpsed by the wrong person on the wrong day, could become the subject of quiet, damaging conversation across the entire neighborhood within a matter of days. There is a particular kind of exhaustion in this that I think is worth naming honestly, a vigilance that never fully switches off, because you never quite know which ordinary moment, a raised voice heard through an open window, a delivery boy noticing the household has cut back to a cheaper cut of meat, a caller arriving unannounced at an inconvenient hour, and glimpsing something backstage that was never meant to be seen, might become the small seed of a story that grows into something genuinely damaging to the family's standing. This is not paranoia on Beatrice's part. It is a realistic, well-calibrated response to a social world that genuinely operated this way, that had, in the absence of the legal and financial mechanisms we rely on today, made reputation itself into something close to a form of currency, tradable, damageable, and desperately important to protect. And yet, alongside all of this pressure, I do not want you to walk away from tonight thinking Beatrice's life contained nothing but strain and performance, because that would be its own kind of distortion, just as flattening as the soft focus portrait version we opened by rejecting. There is real pleasure in this life too, genuine and specific rather than merely theoretical. The particular satisfaction of a needlework project finished well, held up to the light and found by her own exacting standard to be good. The quiet contentment of a Sunday afternoon when the whole family is gathered and nothing in particular needs managing for an hour or two. The real warm companionship of the friendships she has built with other women through years of calling and visiting, friendships that, whatever their origins in social obligation, often deepened over time into something genuinely sustaining, women who understood exactly what her days contained because their own days contained the same things, who could offer a kind of specific, knowing sympathy that nobody outside this particular world could quite provide. Beatrice's life, examined honestly and completely, was neither the gilded fantasy of the popular imagination, nor a simple story of oppression and nothing else. It was, like most real lives in most periods of history, considerably more mixed, more textured, more genuinely human than either simple story allows. Beatrice's household sits at a fairly specific point on what was actually a wide, textured spectrum of middle-class experience, and I do not want to leave you with the impression that every household calling itself respectable in this period looked exactly like hers. Further up the scale, a household with a husband earning perhaps £400 or £500 a year, a successful shopkeeper or a well-established solicitor might employ 2 or 3 servants, a cook as well as a housemaid, freeing the mistress of the house from the direct kitchen labour that occupies so much of Beatrice's week. Though the calling, the accounts, the needlework, the childrearing, and the constant management of appearances remained substantially the same regardless of how many additional hands were available to help. Further down the scale, a household on £100 a year or less, a junior clerk just starting out, a schoolteacher in a modest position, might employ no servant at all for stretches of time, the wife doing every single task herself that Alice helps Beatrice with. And still, this is the detail that I think matters most, still maintaining every scrap of the same social performance, the parlour kept for show, the calling cards exchanged, the Sunday best carefully preserved, because respectability in this world was not simply a function of income, it was a status fiercely, sometimes almost desperately maintained, regardless of how thin the actual resources behind it had become. There is a woman 2 streets over from Beatrice, a schoolteacher's wife whose name I do not know, but whose situation Beatrice has described to me, has described to whoever might be listening tonight, let us say, with a particular kind of quiet sympathy. No servant at all this past year, a single small parlour stove doing the work of a proper range. And yet every single Sunday that family walks to church in clothes brushed and pressed to exactly the same standard as anyone else on the street, because the alternative, appearing anything less than immaculate, was not really an alternative at all. Beatrice sends over a small basket sometimes, quietly, framed as a neighbourly gift rather than anything resembling charity, because charity between equals was its own delicate, carefully worded transaction, one wrong phrase away from turning a kindness into an insult. A jar of the blackberry preserve, perhaps. Some outgrown clothing of Frederick's, offered as though she simply had no more use for it herself, which is not entirely true, and both women understand that perfectly well without either one saying so. This is, I think, one of the most important things to understand about the middle class as a whole in this period, more important in some ways than any single household's particular daily schedule. The middle class was defined less by a specific income level than by a specific relationship to appearance and respectability, a shared commitment to certain visible markers, a parlour kept for show, a servant however minimal, certain standards of dress and manner and church attendance, regardless of how much actual financial strain sat underneath maintaining those markers. This meant that the psychological pressure of maintaining status could, in a strange and genuinely difficult way, weigh most heavily precisely on the households with the least real margin for error, the ones just barely inside the boundary of respectability, terrified of the visible signs that would mark a slide back down into a category their whole social identity depended on staying clear of. Beatrice, sitting comfortably enough in the middle of this spectrum, at least has some cushion. Many women in her exact social position had considerably less, and lived their entire lives with a low, constant hum of financial anxiety running underneath every carefully composed Thursday afternoon. It is worth mentioning, too, a small number of women who found their way out of this world entirely because their names are the ones that survive most clearly into our own time, and I think it is worth being honest and precise about how they relate to a life like Beatrice's, rather than either ignoring them or, on the other hand, treating them as somehow typical. Florence Nightingale, who came from a considerably wealthier background than Beatrice's, transformed nursing from a disreputable, poorly regarded occupation into a respected profession, and changed the trajectory of public health in ways that still shape hospitals today. George Eliot, whose actual name was Marianne Evans, wrote novels of such depth and moral seriousness that they remain genuinely essential reading more than a century and a half later, though she achieved this partly by living a life that scandalized respectable society, unmarried to the man she considered her husband because he could not legally divorce his existing wife, a choice that placed her for years entirely outside the world of calling cards and Thursday at home days that Beatrice inhabits so carefully. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson pushed her way into the medical profession against enormous, deliberate, institutional resistance, becoming the first woman in England to qualify as a physician through sheer determination, combined with resources and support that most women of Beatrice's more modest means simply did not have access to. I want to be careful here because I think it is easy in telling stories like theirs to accidentally imply that women like Beatrice simply lacked the courage or the ambition that these more famous women possessed, and I do not believe that is a fair or accurate reading of the actual historical situation. Nightingale, Eliot, and Garrett Anderson each combined genuine, exceptional personal talent with a set of circumstances, family wealth, unusual family support, a specific historical moment that opened a door most women never had any realistic access to at all. Beatrice is not lacking in intelligence or capability. She is managing a household budget, a staff of 1-2 children's education and health, an entire complex social apparatus of calling and reputation, with a level of skill and attention that would be recognized in almost any other context as genuine competent management. The door simply was not open to her the way it was eventually through extraordinary effort for a small handful of women whose names we still remember. Most women of her generation lived and died as Beatrice does, skillfully, invisibly, managing a world they had no real power to redesign, and I think their competence deserves to be named and respected exactly as much as the more famous exceptions, even though history by its nature tends to remember the doors that opened, rather than the countless capable people who spent their whole lives on the other side of doors that never did. There is one small crack of that door, though, close enough to Beatrice's own life that it is worth mentioning before we move on. A niece of hers, her sister's eldest girl, sat an entrance examination 2 years ago for a place at Girton, the new women's college attached to Cambridge. Founded not so long before this that it still felt, to most families who heard of it, faintly experimental, faintly daring. She did not get in that year. She sat it again the following autumn and did. Beatrice's sister wrote about it in a letter that arrived on a Tuesday very like this one, and Beatrice remembers reading it twice, standing in the hallway, coat still on from the marketing, before she fully believed what it said. She has mixed feelings about it, if I am honest with you. Feelings she has not fully untangled even now. Pride, certainly, real, warm, unmistakable pride. And something else beneath it, something closer to a kind of vertigo. The sense of watching a door open a crack in a wall she had long since stopped noticing was even there, because noticing it, she suspects, would only have made the wall harder to live beside. Let me tell you about a different kind of day now. Not an ordinary Tuesday or a ritual Monday washing day, but a day that came only occasionally, unpredictably, and disrupted everything else we have discussed tonight in a single stroke, which is the day a child in the household falls seriously ill. This happened to Beatrice 2 winters ago, when Frederick, then 6, developed a fever that would not break, accompanied by a cough that worsened steadily across 3 days until it settled into something the local doctor called in despite the expense because Beatrice's instincts told her this was not an illness to manage alone, diagnosed as a serious case of what the period called inflammation of the lungs, what we would now most likely call pneumonia. For 9 days, the household's entire structure simply dissolved around the single overriding task of nursing him back to health. The account book went unattended. The calling stopped entirely, an absence that any respectable neighbour would have understood immediately and excused without question, because illness, unlike financial strain, was one of the few circumstances that could suspend the social obligations of this world without any cost to reputation at all. Beatrice sat up with Frederick through the worst nights, applying the cool cloths and the mustard poultices that the household manuals and the doctor both recommended, tracking his breathing by ear in the dark, counting the rise and fall of his chest the way you might count something precious and fragile. Because in this period, before antibiotics existed in any form, before there was any reliable medical intervention capable of directly fighting the infection itself, nursing care, careful observation, and simple time were genuinely the primary tools available, and a mother's constant, attentive presence through a crisis like this one was not simply an emotional comfort, It was, in the medical understanding of the time, and arguably an actual practical reality too, a real and significant component of the child's chance of recovery. Edmund, for his part, went to work as usual through most of this period, because a bank clerk's position did not come with anything resembling family leave, and the household's income could not simply pause because a child was ill, which meant that Beatrice managed the crisis substantially alone during the daylight hours, with Alice's help where Alice's other duties allowed, snatching what sleep she could in a chair pulled beside Frederick's bed rather than in her own room down the hall. Frederick recovered slowly over the following weeks, and the household eventually returned to its ordinary rhythm. The calling resumed, the account book caught up on, the small accumulated backlog of mending addressed in evenings that had, for those 9 days, belonged entirely to something more urgent. But I think this episode reveals something true that the ordinary Tuesdays and Thursdays of this story tend to obscure, which is the sheer depth of responsibility that rested on Beatrice specifically, not as an abstract social role but as the single, irreplaceable person whose vigilance and care, in the moment it actually mattered most, stood between her child and a genuinely uncertain outcome. Whatever else this life was, performance and constraint and quiet financial anxiety, it was also, underneath everything else, this. A woman who did not sleep for 9 nights because her son needed her not to. There is a small photograph that came out of that illness actually, taken perhaps a month after Frederick recovered, once he had colour back in his face and Beatrice finally felt it was safe to spend the money. A carte de visite, a small card-mounted photograph, the size of a playing card, taken at a studio in town with a painted backdrop of a vaguely classical garden that has nothing whatsoever to do with anything in Frederick's actual life. His hair combed flat with water, his good jacket buttoned to the throat, standing rigidly still for the many long seconds the exposure required, because photography in this period demanded a stillness that no real 8-year-old naturally possesses, achieved usually through a combination of stern instruction and, occasionally, a small hidden clamp behind the head to prevent blurring. Beatrice keeps this photograph in a small album on the whatnot shelf, alongside similar cards of Louisa, of Edmund, of her own late mother taken not long before she died. She does not look at it often, but she knows exactly which page it is on, and some nights, passing through the parlor after everyone else has gone up, she opens the album to that page for no more than a few seconds, closes it again and goes on to bed. Something almost unbearably tender sits inside a photograph like that. Honestly, a boy forced to stand rigid for a machine he barely understood, captured in a single frozen second that his mother will keep returning to for the rest of her life, long after he has grown, long after this particular illness has become nothing more than an old, half-remembered scare. He does not know, standing there in his buttoned jacket, exactly what he is being given to her. She does. Seasons mattered enormously to the shape of Beatrice's year, far more than they tend to matter to a modern household insulated by central heating and electric light and refrigeration, and it is worth walking briefly through how differently her days felt in December compared to the October Tuesday we have spent most of tonight inside. Winter brought heavier coal bills, more hours spent indoors in close quarters, a greater burden of illness moving through the household and the wider neighbourhood, as everyone huddled together against the cold in poorly ventilated rooms. It also brought, on the worst days, a particular kind of fog that anyone living in or near a large coal-burning city in this period came to know intimately and dread specifically. Not the soft grey natural mist that rolls in off open countryside, but something thicker, yellowish, tasting faintly of sulphur at the back of the throat, made from ordinary river fog mixed with the smoke of tens of thousands of household chimneys all burning coal at once, trapped low over the streets on a still cold day until visibility dropped to a few feet and lamps had to be lit at noon. Beatrice keeps the children indoors entirely on days like this, and even indoors she notices it, a faint haze in the parlor itself if a window has been left open even briefly, a specific taste on the air that she has never once seen properly explained to her satisfaction, though she has certainly heard enough theories offered at enough calling afternoons to fill a small book of her own. And then it brought Christmas, which in this period was still relatively recently being reshaped into something closer to the version we would recognize today. A domestic, family-centered celebration increasingly built around a decorated tree, a practice that had gained enormous popularity following its association with the royal family a few decades earlier, and around a substantial dinner that Beatrice would spend the better part of a week preparing for, ordering a goose or, if the year's budget allowed, something grander, well in advance from the poulterer, making the pudding weeks ahead of time according to a recipe passed down from her own mother, allowing it to mature in a cool pantry the way tradition demanded. Christmas, for a household like this one, was itself a small performance of prosperity and warmth, gifts modest by later standards but chosen with real care, small toys for the children, a new pair of gloves for Edmund, decorations made largely by hand, paper chains and holly gathered from a nearby hedgerow rather than purchased. Because even at Christmas, even in the season most associated with generous spending, the underlying habits of careful economy that governed the rest of Beatrice's year did not simply switch off. Summer, by contrast, brought its own particular relief and its own particular labor, longer daylight easing the burden of expensive artificial light, but also bringing its own domestic challenges, food spoiling faster in the heat without any reliable refrigeration, requiring more frequent, careful marketing, flies and general household pests to be managed more aggressively, and, for families who could manage it, perhaps a brief holiday, a week or two at the seaside, which had become an increasingly popular and increasingly accessible middle-class ritual as railway travel made coastal towns reachable in a way they simply had not been a generation earlier. I think about Beatrice packing for a family holiday at the seaside, an event that would have represented one of the genuine, uncomplicated pleasures of her year, and even here, even in this moment of leisure, the packing itself, the careful selection of what clothing was needed, the arrangement for Alice to either accompany the family or to use the week to deep clean the house in their absence, the letters to be written ahead securing lodgings, all of it required exactly the same kind of careful, competent management that governed every other part of her life. Leisure, in other words, even when it arrived, rarely arrived unmanaged. It had to be organized, planned for, budgeted, and executed with the same quiet competence Beatrice brought to everything else. But once they actually arrived, once the lodging house key was in hand and the trunk unpacked into an unfamiliar chest of drawers, something in Beatrice does seem to have genuinely loosened, at least according to the one surviving photograph from a seaside week 2 summers back, in which she is laughing at something outside the frame, her bonnet slightly crooked, one hand shading her eyes against a sun that never quite reaches this far into any of her ordinary days at home. Frederick and Louisa spent that week collecting shells and being chased, shrieking, by a tide that never quite caught them, and Edmund rolled his trousers to the knee and waded in further than any respectable bank clerk strictly should have, and for 6 days the account book stayed shut in a drawer back home, and the parlor went undusted, and nobody on this particular stretch of unfamiliar coastline knew or cared which afternoon was Beatrice's at-home day. There is one more piece of household technology worth mentioning before we let this day finish properly, because it represents one of the genuine, meaningful changes happening quietly across exactly this period, and that is the sewing machine, which by the 1870s had become increasingly available to middle-class households, sold on installment plans much like the piano, and which had begun gradually to change the actual physical experience of the needlework that occupied so much of Beatrice's week. The treadle sewing machine, operated by a foot pedal that freed both hands for guiding the fabric, could complete a straight seam in a fraction of the time hand sewing required, and Beatrice, who acquired one of these machines 2 years ago, a genuine, carefully considered household investment discussed with Edmund for weeks before the purchase, has found that certain kinds of mending and dressmaking that once consumed entire evenings now take a fraction of the time, freeing up hours that she has in practice mostly redirected toward other tasks rather than toward actual rest. Because that is simply how household labor tends to work in every era, expanding to fill whatever time becomes available rather than shrinking to leave genuine leisure behind. The negotiation over that purchase actually tells you something about the marriage itself. Edmund was hesitant at first, not because he doubted its usefulness, but because it represented a payment stretched across many months, a small standing obligation added to a budget that already felt, some months, stretched thin enough. Beatrice made her case carefully over several evenings, not with numbers exactly, though she had those ready too, but by pointing out gently exactly how many hours a week the machine would save, and what she might do with hours that were at present simply gone. He agreed eventually, and she has never once let him regret it, which is its own kind of quiet vindication. The machine sitting now in the corner of the dining room, treadle worn smooth in the shape of her foot, doing exactly what she promised it would. I find this detail quietly instructive, actually, because it complicates any simple story about technology automatically improving women's lives across this period. The sewing machine genuinely did reduce the raw hours required for certain tasks, but the standard for what a well-run household was expected to produce, the number of garments properly made and remade, the elaborateness of decorative needlework expected in a well-furnished parlor, simply rose to absorb the new capacity, the way it so often does with new domestic technology across history, right up through the washing machines and dishwashers that would eventually promise, and only partially deliver, similar liberation to households a century later. Beatrice does not experience this as a philosophical observation, of course. She experiences it simply as more time to get more done, and more done is in this particular life always simply more done, folded quietly into the same relentless, competent, largely unacknowledged rhythm that has carried her through every other hour of this long October day. October, specifically, carried its own particular task that we have not yet mentioned tonight, and it fits naturally here, because it is happening this very week in Beatrice's kitchen, tucked in around everything else we have already described. This is the season for putting up preserves, for stocking the larder against the lean months ahead, and it is heavy, hot, exacting work, done in a kitchen already warm from the range, surrounded by baskets of apples and blackberries and the last of the season's plums, bought cheaply from a costermonger's cart because slightly bruised fruit, unsuitable for eating fresh, was perfectly suitable for boiling down into jam. Beatrice stands over a large preserving pan for hours at a stretch, stirring, skimming the foam that rises to the surface, testing the set by dropping a small spoonful onto a cold saucer, and watching whether it wrinkles properly when pushed with a finger, a test passed down, like so much else in this kitchen, from her own mother, who learned it from hers. The jars themselves, washed and dried and warmed slightly so the hot preserve will not crack the glass, are sealed with a disc of waxed paper and a covering of parchment tied down with string, and by the end of a long October afternoon, a full shelf in the pantry stands lined with jars of blackberry and apple jam, plum preserve, and perhaps a jar or two of something slightly more ambitious, a quince paste or a spiced pickle, that Beatrice makes because her mother always made it, and because Edmund, in a rare moment of specific, spoken appreciation, once mentioned that he particularly liked it. This work will feed the family through the winter months when fresh fruit is unavailable and expensive, another quiet, physical contribution to the household budget that never appears anywhere in the account book as a line item, because it is simply labor absorbed invisibly into the ordinary expectation of what a competent housewife produces without being asked. There is something almost meditative in this work, honestly, despite the heat and the hours it demands. A kind of satisfaction that Beatrice finds nowhere else quite so directly, watching a basket of soft, bruised, nearly wasted fruit become, through her own attention and skill, a shelf of jars that will last the family for months, tangible evidence of care in a way that so much of her other labor, dusted away or eaten or worn out within days, never quite manages to be. She will open one of these jars in January on a grey morning when the garden outside is bare and the fruit trees are nothing but dark branches against a colder sky, and for a moment, spreading blackberry jam on a piece of toast for Louisa's breakfast, October will come back to her briefly. The smell of it, the heat of the kitchen, this exact ordinary afternoon we have been describing, folded quietly into a jar on a pantry shelf, and waiting there for her, the way so much of a woman's labour in this world waited, unnoticed, until the precise moment it was needed. A question I raised near the very beginning of tonight's story is still sitting unanswered. What this life actually cost Beatrice, measured not in pounds and shillings, but in something harder to put a number on, and I think it is time to answer it. I think the honest answer is that it cost her a version of herself that never had the chance to exist, not because she lacked the capacity for it, but because the entire structure of the world she was born into simply never asked the question of what else she might have been. We have spent this whole evening cataloguing her competence, her financial management, her medical care, her social diplomacy, her needlework, her patient teaching of 2 children, her quiet endurance through grief and illness, and the constant low hum of appearances that had to be maintained regardless of what was actually happening underneath them. If you gathered up everything Beatrice does in a single ordinary week and handed the exact same list of tasks to a modern household, you would be describing the combined responsibilities of a bookkeeper, a chef, a tailor, a teacher, a nurse, a diplomat, and an event planner, performed by one person, for no wage, with no recognition that any of it constitutes work at all. And I think that is really the heart of what makes this particular history worth telling slowly, the way we have told it tonight, rather than rushing through it as a list of quaint customs and curious facts. It is not simply that Beatrice's life was hard, though parts of it certainly were. It is that an entire sophisticated, demanding body of skilled labour was performed by millions of women exactly like her across an entire century, and the society that depended on that labour almost entirely refused to see it as labour at all, filing it instead under the vague, comfortable heading of simply being a good wife, a good mother, a respectable woman managing her natural sphere. The parlour stayed dusted, the accounts stayed balanced, the children stayed fed and clothed and educated. The husband's collars stayed starched, and his dinner stayed on the table at the same hour every single evening. And none of it, by the logic of the world Beatrice lived inside, counted as anything at all. I do not think Beatrice herself experienced her life primarily through this lens, and I want to be honest about that, rather than projecting a modern frustration backward onto a woman who, by every indication we have from the historical record, found real meaning, real pride, and real occasional joy inside the life she actually lived. She was not, in her own mind, a victim of an unjust system, waiting for liberation that would not properly arrive for her granddaughters and great-granddaughters. She was a competent woman doing difficult work well, inside the only world she had ever known, and there is a real dignity in that, a dignity that does not require us to pretend the system around her was fair, in order to fully honour the skill and care she brought to living inside it. Picture this particular October Tuesday one more time, quickly, the way you might glance back at a road just travelled. Something about holding the whole shape of it together before we let the day finally close feels right, so bear with me. Before 6 in the morning, awake in the dark, listening for a fire that had not yet been lit, dressing herself, every hook and lace, without help, down to a cold kitchen to help produce a breakfast that her own husband would never think to thank her for, because he did not know in any real sense that thanking was required. 2 children washed, dressed, fed, and sent into their separate gendered futures before 8 in the morning had properly arrived. An account book balanced by 9:30, a whole invisible architecture of financial survival built from figures written in a plain ruled notebook. Marketing done on foot, in public, negotiating pennies while performing a complete indifference to pennies, hours in a hot kitchen with reddened hands, a parlour dusted and arranged for an audience that might never come. An afternoon of calling cards, of needlework held in the lap, while conversation about the weather carried the actual business of maintaining a social network worth years of careful investment. A washing day or an ironing day, somewhere in the week's rhythm that left her hands looking, for one day at least, exactly like the hired washerwoman's hands beside her. A charitable visit into a poorer part of town, carrying both real help and real, unexamined condescension in the same basket. A husband's return, a dinner served, a conversation carried mostly by his day rather than hers. 2 children put to bed with a washed face and a whispered prayer. An hour of genuine, unwitnessed companionship with the one person in her life who saw her, at least partially, without the performance attached. And now, finally, close to 11 at night, the house settling into its last quiet hour, Beatrice alone for a few minutes in her room, brushing out her hair by candlelight before sleep. This was one day. It was not by any measure an unusually difficult or unusually dramatic day. No crisis, no illness, nothing that would have struck Beatrice herself as remarkable enough to record in any detail in a letter to her sister. It was, simply, Tuesday. And I think that is exactly why it matters, why an entire episode built around one ordinary Tuesday in 1876 tells you something that no single dramatic event ever could, which is what an entire life stretched across decades actually consisted of when you strip away the fairy tale version and look honestly at the accumulated weight of 1,000 identical Tuesdays, each one demanding the same competence, the same invisibility, the same quiet, unacknowledged labor, performed without complaint because complaint itself was never really part of the available vocabulary. There is a particular ritual to closing up a house like this one for the night, and it belonged, in most households of this class, specifically to whoever remained downstairs longest, which some nights was Edmund, and some nights, more often than either of them would probably have admitted was slightly unfair, was Beatrice herself. Checking that the fires had been properly banked, coals arranged and covered with ash in a way that would let them hold their heat through the night, without burning through the household's coal supply too quickly. A small skill in itself, judged wrong too often, and either the house grew uncomfortably cold by morning, or the coal bill crept upward in a way the account book would register uncomfortably at the end of the month. Checking that the doors were bolted, the windows properly latched, a task that carried a small, real weight of responsibility in an era before any of the security systems or street lights that a modern household takes entirely for granted, when a poorly secured ground floor window genuinely represented a real, if statistically modest, risk to a family sleeping upstairs. Alice's candle, if she had gone up already, would be the last small light visible from the street, flickering faintly behind the small attic window, before it too went dark, and the house stood fully quiet against the October night. Beatrice makes her way up the stairs a little after 11, candle in hand, past the closed door of the room where Frederick and Louisa sleep, close enough that she pauses, out of habit rather than any particular concern tonight, to listen for a moment to the quality of their breathing, a small maternal reflex that she probably could not stop even if she tried, built into her now after 8 years of exactly this kind of listening. Everything sounds right. Everything sounds like an ordinary, uneventful night, the kind that does not get remembered afterward, the kind that simply accumulates, one after another, into the actual substance of a life. Before the hairbrush, there is the corset, and I want to linger here for a moment, because unlacing at the end of a day is its own small, private ceremony that almost nothing written about this period ever bothers to mention. Beatrice reaches behind herself, awkwardly, the same half contortion she used this morning in reverse, working the laces loose one crossing at a time, and there is a particular distinct feeling to that first full breath once the last hook gives way, a feeling she has never once described to anyone because there has never been anyone to describe it to, a small private exhale that belongs entirely to this hour and no other. The dress comes off next, hung carefully on its form rather than dropped, because tomorrow it will need pressing if it is dropped, and pressing takes time she would rather spend elsewhere. The stays, the layers, one after another, until what remains is simply a woman in a plain cotton nightgown, standing in a cold room entirely herself for the first time since roughly 6 o'clock this morning. In her own room, Edmund already settled and nearly asleep. Beatrice sits for a few minutes at the small dressing table by candlelight and takes down her hair, brushing it out slowly, 100 strokes more or less, not because any book has told her to, though several would have, but because it is simply the habit that closes her day, the last small private ritual before sleep, unwitnessed by anyone, unassessed, uncorrelated to any social obligation at all. Her hands, still slightly reddened from Monday's washing, still faintly scarred at the wrist from a kettle 2 winters gone, move through this familiar motion with the ease of something done 10,000 times before. The candle gutters slightly in a small draught from the window, and for just a moment the shadows in the room shift and settle, and she looks in the low light exactly like what she is, which is a tired, capable woman near the end of a long, ordinary day, with nobody left to perform for. Watch the candlelight for a moment, the way it moves. It catches the pale stripe of the wallpaper first, a small floral pattern chosen 4 years ago from a sample book the paperhanger left behind for a week, and throws it slightly larger than life onto the far wall, shifting gently each time the flame bends. It touches the corner of the looking glass, a small answering point of gold. It does not reach the far side of the room at all, which stays in the kind of soft, complete darkness that a modern bedroom, lit by streetlight leaking through a blind, almost never achieves anymore. This is what night actually looked like for most of human history. Small, contained, a single warm point of light holding back a darkness that pressed close on every side of it, and Beatrice, brushing her hair inside that small circle of light, has never known anything else, and would probably find our version, our rooms that never go properly dark at all, faintly strange, faintly too loud, if she could somehow see one. She thinks briefly before blowing out the candle about tomorrow, Wednesday, the district visiting in the morning, a letter she still owes her sister, the state of the coal supply, which she suspects will need replenishing before the week is out. Small things, manageable things, the particular quiet arithmetic of a life spent holding a great many small things steady at once, so steady, so continuously, that almost nobody around her ever notices the holding at all. On her way to bed she passed that same small hallway mirror we started this evening beside, the one with the silvering worn thin at the corners, and caught her own reflection in it for perhaps half a second, candle in hand, without stopping to check anything at all this time. Nothing to adjust, no collar to straighten, no caller waiting behind a door somewhere ahead of her, just a woman passing her own reflection at the end of a long day, seen and unseen in the same brief instant, before the candlelight moved on and the mirror went back to its ordinary business of hanging quietly in a dark hallway, waiting for morning, waiting for the next small check of a collar, a bonnet, the face arranged just so before a door opens onto a world that expects a certain kind of composure and rarely asks what it costs to produce it. She blows out the candle, the room goes dark, and outside, faintly through the window she has left cracked slightly for air, the sound of a horse and cart passing somewhere in the distance, the last sound of the evening, and then nothing, just the particular deep quiet of a house at rest, everyone inside it finally asleep. And that is where we will leave Beatrice tonight, in the dark, in the quiet, at the exact centre of a life that history mostly forgot to write down, precisely because it looked from the outside like nothing worth writing down at all. No battles fought, no books published, no professions entered or barriers broken, just a woman who rose before dawn and did not stop until well past dark, day after day, year after year, holding together a household, a marriage, 2 children, and an entire fragile performance of respectability, with a skill and a steadiness that deserved, and rarely received, any name more generous than simply doing what a wife does. I think she deserves better than that, honestly, even now, even only in the telling. I think all of them do. All the Beatrices, All the women whose names never made it into any history book because their whole lives were spent making sure nothing about them ever looked remarkable at all. The candle is out now. The house is quiet. Somewhere in that quiet, a woman who worked harder than almost anyone around her ever knew is finally simply asleep. And I think that is a good place for you to be too right about now. Wherever you are tonight, whatever your own ordinary Tuesday looked like today, I hope some part of you feels a little lighter for having spent this hour somewhere else, in a colder house in a quieter century, beside a woman who never once complained and never once stopped. Sleep well, friend. We will go somewhere else together again soon.